Tonight, we are going to Boston. Not only the Boston of schoolbook memory, with its lanterns, tea chests, brick meeting houses, and well-rehearsed stories about revolution, but another Boston as well. A quieter Boston. A stranger one. A city that has spent centuries changing its face so often that even the ground beneath it can no longer be trusted to tell a simple story. At first glance, Boston can feel easy to explain. It is one of the oldest great cities in the United States. It is compact, walkable, almost theatrical in the way it displays its age. It has streets so narrow they seem inherited from another continent, graveyards so old that names have weathered into stone-gray whispers, and neighborhoods whose reputations have become national shorthand. It is a city that appears to remember itself very well. But that appearance is part of the mystery, because Boston is also a city of buried things. Buried shorelines, buried foundations, buried institutions. Buried evidence of people who once stood at the center of daily life and later slipped toward the margins of public memory. It is a city where familiar ground was not always ground, where neighborhoods could vanish while street names survived, where entire chapters of suffering were pushed outward to islands and edges, and where, every so often, construction crews and archaeologists uncover a reminder that the city above is only the latest version of the city below. And that is where our story begins to shift. To understand Boston as a lost mystery, you have to set aside the idea that history lives only in monuments. In a place like this, the most revealing histories are often the ones that were paved over, filled in, broken apart, relocated, forgotten, or left behind in storage boxes and soil layers. Some of them survive as oddities. A gravestone discovered where no modern passerby expected one. Ceramics buried beneath newer streets. A tunnel under a civic center. A frame hanging empty in a museum. A shoreline remembered by maps but no longer visible to the eye. The result is a city that can feel, in the deepest sense, double. There is the Boston people visit, and there is the Boston that lingers beneath it. For a long time, those two Bostons were not easy to separate. The original city, settled on the Shawmut Peninsula, was shaped by hills, coves, marshes, and narrow necks of land that made it feel almost improvised by geology. What later became a dense urban core began as something far more uneven, more vulnerable, and more intimate with water than the modern skyline suggests. The city's edges were fluid. The harbor pushed inward. Tidal flats and inlets cut into the land. Places that would one day hold brick blocks, offices, stations, and elegant rows of buildings were once exposed to weather, tide, and silt. That earlier landscape matters because Boston did not merely grow over time. It remade itself. It cut down hills. It filled coves. It extended shorelines. It transformed water into land and then taught later generations to forget that the transformation had happened at all. Modern Boston can appear old, but much of the ground people take for granted is younger than the memory attached to the city's name. In that sense, one of Boston's oldest mysteries is also one of its largest. Where exactly is the original city? And how much of what feels ancient is standing on territory that, in an earlier century, did not exist in the same form at all? That question can sound abstract until you begin to imagine daily life in a place built by such revisions. A person walks down a street, stops for coffee, checks a phone, boards a train, meets a friend, never noticing that underfoot there may once have been a shoreline, a rope walk, a cellar, a ship berth, a workshop, a schoolyard, a burial place, or a patch of mud beside dark water. The city continues above, efficient and self-assured, while below it rests a compact archive of former Bostons, layered one atop another. Archaeology makes this visible. Official archaeology work in Boston has emphasized that the city contains hundreds of known archaeological sites. That number alone changes the emotional scale of the place. It suggests not a handful of isolated discoveries, but a whole hidden infrastructure of memory. A city can appear fully documented and still contain an astonishing amount that remains physically tucked away. Archaeology in Boston is not an exotic side note. It is one of the most direct ways the city learns what it used to be. And what it used to be is often stranger than expected. National Park Service materials describing urban archaeology point to Boston as a place where archaeologists have found crypts, sunken ships, and 17th-century schools. Just pause on that list for a moment. Crypts, sunken ships, 17th-century schools. Those are not merely artifacts of age. They are evidence that the modern city has sealed older worlds into itself. They remind us that the line between ruin and routine is thinner than it looks. What now seems stable was once improvised. What now appears visible was once hidden. And what now feels ordinary may be resting on a structure of forgotten improvisations. This is one reason Boston lends itself so naturally to slow mystery. The city does not need a single dramatic secret to become compelling. Its mystery is cumulative. A buried object here, a missing neighborhood there, a vanished shoreline, a renamed district, a half-remembered institution on an island, a catastrophe turned into folklore, an unsolved theft whose absence is preserved more carefully than many solved events are remembered. The more you look, the less final the city seems. Take the matter of schools, for example. In a city celebrated for education, even the idea of a school becomes ghostly when traced into the deeper past. Archaeologists surveying the area around Old City Hall have searched for evidence related to the earliest Boston Latin School, a 17th-century institution whose intellectual legacy became enormous while its physical traces drifted into uncertainty. There is something deeply Bostonian about that contrast. Reputation remains brightly lit. Material evidence becomes difficult to locate. The institution survives in story, but the ground must still be asked where, exactly, the old world stood. Or consider the moments when the city reveals itself by accident. Construction is usually understood as a sign of the future. New buildings, new utilities, new transit systems, new foundations. But in Boston, construction also behaves like an interrogation of the past. Dig deep enough, and the city begins answering questions no one intended to ask that day. Public archaeology materials from Boston highlight stories such as a 300-year-old gravestone found during construction. Imagine that moment. Machines, schedules, permits, noise, men and women expecting to move forward through a workday, and then a piece of the 18th century interrupts the modern rhythm. Not as metaphor, not as museum display, as a physical insistence that the ground remembers. The gravestone is important, not simply because it is old, but because of what it does to time. It collapses distance. 300 years ceases to be a chapter in a book and becomes an object that had been near people all along, just out of sight. It forces a modern city to acknowledge that it never entirely escaped the presence of its dead. Boston's buried ceramics tell a similar story, though from a different angle. Archaeology materials have drawn attention to ceramics from Puritan Boston that came from around the world. That detail is easy to glide past, yet it quietly overturns a common image of the early city as culturally sealed, provincial, or simple. Ceramics preserve the roots of trade, taste, aspiration, and contact. A bowl, a cup, a plate, a shard of decorated ware can reveal a port city linked to larger worlds. Here again, the mystery is not that Boston had a past. The mystery is how often the city's buried evidence complicates the version of that past people think they know. Even archival records can carry this feeling when framed properly. Public history work in Boston has also highlighted women's voting registry records from 1920, when women were newly enfranchised. At first, that may not sound like a mystery in the same sense as a crypt or a sunken ship, but in another way, it is exactly that. Records like these remind us how many immense transformations in city life leave behind quiet paper trails rather than monuments. They ask which lives were made newly visible, which names entered civic systems for the first time, and how easily those names might vanish again into administrative obscurity unless someone chooses to look. That is one of the recurring patterns of Boston's lost histories. Not disappearance without trace, but trace without adequate attention. An abandoned subway tunnel under City Hall can provoke the imagination because it feels cinematic, as if a hidden city runs below the official one. Yet the tunnel also illustrates a broader truth. Infrastructure ages into secrecy. What once served movement becomes stillness. What was once part of the city's daily pulse becomes an inaccessible corridor beneath later layers of public life. In a place with Boston's age, systems do not simply get replaced. They linger. They echo. They wait in darkness while the city above rearranges itself and forgets the route below. If you are enjoying this journey through Boston's hidden past, take a moment to like, subscribe, and comment your current city below. And if you'd like to read America's history in PDF form, the ebook series link is in the description. Then, as we continue, let that small pause become part of the atmosphere as well, because the city we are entering does not reveal itself all at once. One of the most useful ways to think about Boston is not as a fixed place, but as a series of negotiations between memory and pressure. Pressure from commerce, pressure from growth, pressure from immigration and disease and war and real estate and engineering and political ambition. Each pressure changed what the city allowed itself to keep visible. Some chapters became symbols, others were moved aside, others sank under the weight of progress. Others remained present only to specialists, archivists, local historians, descendants, or the occasional startled worker who found something old where no one expected it. This is why a city can become mysterious without becoming unknowable. Boston is documented. Boston is studied. Boston is narrated constantly. And still, its hidden layers remain emotionally powerful because documentation is not the same thing as felt awareness. Most people do not walk around with old shoreline maps in mind. Most do not picture internment camps while looking out across harbor water. Most do not think of vanished household objects while crossing busy intersections. Most do not imagine that under a polished institution there may be empty frames, sealed vaults, or replaced foundations telling a quieter truth. The best hidden histories are often like that. They do not need to be absolutely unknown. They only need to have slipped out of the foreground. A travel piece on Boston's hidden history made a useful observation in this regard. The city's better-known revolutionary narrative can overshadow stranger, quieter stories. That feels exactly right. The familiar version of Boston is so strong that it casts a long shadow. Walk the Freedom Trail, and the city seems to line itself up obediently for interpretation. One event leads to another. One hero follows another. One site confirms the meaning of the next. It is clean, teachable, satisfying. But real cities are never so orderly. Behind the polished sequence lies a messier accumulation of lives that did not all fit the same national script. Harbor quarantine stations, places of confinement, buried trade goods, erased ethnic neighborhoods, industrial accidents that became legend, fires that removed entire streetscapes, museums that preserve absence, cemeteries hidden by later changes, transit routes that died below civic plazas. The city's lost mysteries live in those less rehearsed places where development and forgetting work together. And sometimes the forgetting was almost practical. A city that changes rapidly cannot mourn every structure equally. It cannot tell every story with the same urgency. Economic life keeps moving. New waves of residents inherit street plans and district names without always inheriting a full emotional map of what came before. This is normal. It happens everywhere. Yet in Boston, the pattern can feel unusually intense because of the sheer density of the past. There is simply so much history concentrated in so little space that omission becomes inevitable. No one narrative can hold it all, which means that what is left out begins to accumulate its own atmosphere. That atmosphere is what we are following tonight. We are following it into the harbor, where Boston pushed some of its hardest memories to the edges of the map. We are following it into the ground, where old objects wait for accidental return. We are following it into neighborhoods remembered more vividly by those who lost them than by the city that replaced them. We are following it into catastrophe, where a fire can erase a district in hours and a tank of molasses can turn industrial negligence into folklore. And eventually, we are following it into a museum where the mystery is not what was displayed, but what is still missing. Before we go outward to the islands and inward to the deeper layers, it helps to linger a little longer on the idea of the city remaking its own body. Modern Boston does not simply occupy old terrain. In major ways, it manufactured new terrain. Coves were filled, marshes covered, shorelines redrawn. This physical expansion allowed the city to grow in power and population, but it also had a psychological effect. It detached daily life from earlier natural boundaries. A harbor inlet became a street grid. A wet edge became commercial land. Water was turned into real estate, and once that transformation stabilized, later generations could experience the result as if it had always been solid. Yet the older geography still exerts pressure through maps, records, engineering difficulties, and archaeology. The past shape of the peninsula never fully disappears. It becomes a hidden argument beneath the visible city. That hidden argument is one reason Boston often feels haunted, even when nothing overtly supernatural is involved. A haunted city, in the deepest historical sense, is not merely a place of ghosts. It is a place where previous versions of reality remain active in the background. Old boundaries influence new problems. Forgotten uses explain current oddities. Lost neighborhoods alter emotional memory. Buried structures redirect attention. Places keep acting like what they used to be, even after their surfaces have changed. You see this in waterfront histories. You see it in infrastructure. You see it in preserved names whose original landscapes have been transformed. You see it in how often Boston's most revealing mysteries involve not alien intrusions, but returns. Returns of evidence. Returns of questions. Returns of names. Returns of stories that were not exactly erased, only displaced. And perhaps that is the gentlest way to define a lost mystery. Not a story no one can recover, but a story that a city stopped keeping in easy view. In the hours ahead, as Boston grows quieter around us, we will move through those displaced stories one by one. We will watch the harbor become a borderland for disease, exile, punishment, and institutional forgetting. We will see how a neighborhood can survive most vividly after its buildings are gone. We will stand in the afterimage of disasters that changed the city faster than memory could fully absorb. And we will end in a place where absence itself has been carefully curated, where empty frames still hold open a question that the city has not managed to close. For now, though, just keep one image in mind. a person walking through Boston at night. Above them, streetlights, brick walls, apartment windows, traffic signals, museum facades, polished plaques, steady sidewalks, and the reassuring surfaces of a major American city. Below them, another Boston. A Boston of crypts, filled water, broken ceramics, old paperwork, vanished homes, discarded routes, and unfinished questions. The visible city is real, but it is not alone. And once you notice that, Boston becomes much harder to see in only one way. The mystery deepens further when we leave the center and move toward the harbor, because the harbor was never just scenery. It was an engine, a threshold, and, when the city found certain problems difficult to place in ordinary view, a kind of outer chamber. Harbors connect places, but they also separate them. Water can welcome commerce, immigration, and communication, while also giving a city convenient distance from what it does not wish to place at its heart. Boston understood this very early. Its islands were not blank spaces on a map. They became working parts of a moral geography. Some islands received quarantine stations and hospitals. Some were tied to military use. Some housed institutions for the poor, the sick, the confined, or the inconvenient. To read the harbor as leisure alone is to miss a more complicated truth. The water did not merely surround Boston. It helped Boston organize what could be seen, what could be managed, and what could be forgotten more easily. That pattern becomes especially powerful on Deer Island, which may be one of the clearest examples of how a place can accumulate difficult histories until it seems to contain several different moral worlds at once. Today, Deer Island can be experienced as open space beside industrial infrastructure. There are walking paths, there are views. There is a wastewater treatment plant whose giant digesters have become a recognizable landmark in their own right. Many people know the island, if they know it at all, as part of the environmental story of modern Boston. Sanitation, engineering, recovery, stewardship. That is the latest layer. But the earlier layers remain. Long before the modern plant, Deer Island was used by indigenous peoples. That fact alone should slow us down. So much of Boston's public storytelling begins after English settlement, as if the city's deepest history starts only once colonial records become abundant. Yet the harbor landscape had human meaning long before that. The islands were not empty, waiting rooms for future institutions. They already belonged to living geographies of movement, use, and relation. Then came one of the darkest chapters in the harbor's history. During King Philip's War, in the winter of 1675 to 1676, Deer Island became a place of internment for approximately 500 indigenous people removed from their homes and villages by colonial authorities. Many died there in winter conditions without adequate food or shelter. It is hard to overstate what this does to the emotional map of Boston. A place now visited for exercise and views was once part prison camp, part abandonment, part colonial violence made geographic, and still, that is not the end of the island's transformations. In the 19th century, Deer Island became tied to quarantine and migration. When the Great Famine drove Irish refugees across the Atlantic, thousands came toward Boston, carrying illness, poverty, hope, exhaustion, grief, and uncertainty. In 1847, the city established a hospital on the island. Thousands of famine migrants were treated there. Many recovered. Hundreds did not. More than 800 were buried in Rest Haven Cemetery, their memory attached to a landscape many later Bostonians would know only in fragments, if at all. Once again, the harbor absorbed what the city center did not. The sick were moved outward. The poor were housed outward. The dead remained outward. Deer Island later held an almshouse, a house of correction, military installations, sewage facilities. One site after another. One function after another. The island became a kind of revolving edge for lives and conditions that Boston handled at a distance. Not invisible, exactly, but easier to keep from the ceremonial heart of the city. That is what makes Deer Island feel like more than a historical location. It feels like a revelation about the city's habits of memory. Boston did not only build monuments, it also built margins, and often the margins tell the harder truth. If Boston's central myths often focus on defiance, intellect, commerce, and civic firsts, Deer Island reminds us that another Boston was built through exclusion, sorting, and managed distance. It is one thing to celebrate a city for being old. It is another to ask what old cities did with those they feared, those they pitied, those they blamed, or those whose suffering they preferred to process offshore. The harbor islands as a whole carry this layered feeling. Official historical descriptions emphasize quarantine stations, hospitals, and military uses. That combination alone produces a certain atmosphere. Disease, defense, confinement, weather, distance. Islands are practical places for such functions, but practicality can become moral camouflage. Once a place sits just offshore, it becomes easier for a mainland population to imagine that its difficult histories belong somehow to another zone. Yet they remain Boston's histories all the same, and perhaps more than most others, because they reveal the city under pressure. A city at ease may speak in architecture and ceremony. A city under strain reveals itself through where it sends the sick, the poor, the imprisoned, the displaced, and the politically troublesome. The harbor islands become, in that sense, a diagnostic landscape. They show how Boston organized fear. At night, when the water is dark and the islands are only shapes against a wider blackness, it is not hard to understand why such places gather myth. But the deeper mystery is not mythical. It is historical. How many people pass through these edges without entering the city's preferred memory of itself? How many family stories ended in institutions that later disappeared? How many graves remain distant from the streets where descendants or strangers now live without knowing what lies out there? How many names were recorded, processed, and then absorbed into bureaucratic silence? These are not mysteries with a single solution. They are mysteries of attention, and Boston is full of them. If the harbor shows us the city's outer margins, the West End shows what can happen much closer to the center when a neighborhood is not pushed offshore but removed in place. Today, the West End exists on official maps as a neighborhood that mixes old and new Boston. It remains geographically present. Institutions stand there. Newer residential life continues there. Roads, buildings, and civic systems identify it as part of the living city. But the West End also occupies a special category in American urban memory. It is one of those places whose loss became almost as historically significant as its earlier life. That is worth sitting with for a moment. Most neighborhoods change gradually enough that memory and built form keep some rough pace with each other. Storefronts shift, populations move, styles alter, and older residents complain that a place is not what it used to be. But in the West End, the transformation became far more abrupt and consequential. What had been a dense, ethnically varied, socially textured urban community was heavily disrupted and largely erased by 20th-century redevelopment. The new city arrived with official language about modernization, housing, efficiency, and future order. The old neighborhood receded into recollection, photographs, testimony, and grief. This creates a different kind of lost mystery. Not an unsolved event, but an unresolved wound in the city's self-understanding. The West End had long been a neighborhood of arrivals, working people, layered identities, crowded buildings, and everyday forms of belonging that planners often struggled to value because such belonging did not always present itself in monumental ways. It was held together by stoops, corner stores, informal networks, routines, accents, errands, nicknames, reciprocal watching, small loyalties, remembered routes. Like many urban communities, it looked disorderly from outside, precisely because so much order existed inside human relationships rather than in formal design. Then came the ideology that saw such places as obsolete. Redevelopment language in the mid-20th century often framed older neighborhoods as blighted. That word did a great deal of work. It turned complicated social worlds into planning problems. It made demolition sound therapeutic. It replaced questions about who lived in a place and what kinds of support they gave one another with questions about building age, density, sanitation, tax base, and visual regularity. Once a neighborhood could be described as a technical failure, it became easier to disregard the human systems it contained. And so the West End became, for many Americans, one of the clearest examples of what it means for a city to keep its name while changing its soul. What was lost there cannot be measured only in structures removed. Buildings matter. Streetscapes matter. But the deeper erasure involved social time. A neighborhood is a kind of memory machine. It teaches residents how to belong through repetition. Which butcher knows your family? Which window light means someone is still awake? Which shortcut a child can take safely? Which church bells, language patterns, and seasonal habits make a place feel like more than coordinates? When redevelopment breaks that machine, people do not simply relocate intact. They lose an ecology. That is one reason the West End remains so haunting in urban history. It was not lost to natural disaster. It was not abandoned slowly to economics alone. It was deliberately transformed in the name of improvement. And improvement, in this case, became one of the city's most unsettling words. Because improve for whom? Modernize for what kind of life? Preserve which memories, and at whose expense? These questions push the West End beyond local history into the larger mystery of urban forgetting. Cities often imagine that replacement is self-justifying. A new building stands where an old one stood. A wider road improves access. A larger institution increases capacity. A cleaner design promises rational order. But what if the displaced value cannot be reassembled? What if a city can build new structures more easily than it can rebuild the trust, intimacy, and thick social memory it has dispersed? Then the vanished neighborhood begins to act like a ghost inside later planning language. That is what the West End does in Boston. It survives not only as a former built environment, but as a warning. A place that continues to ask whether maps and redevelopment brochures can ever fully describe what they erase. In some ways, the West End is among Boston's clearest lost mysteries because its disappearance happened in plain sight, under legal authority, with reports, decisions, timelines, and photographs. There is no uncertainty that transformation occurred. The mystery is how a living neighborhood could be rendered legible mainly as a problem before it was recognized, too late, as a world. The emotional force of that question deepens when we connect it to the rest of Boston's history. This is a city that repeatedly turned difficult complexity into manageable surfaces. It filled water to make land. It shifted institutions to islands. It streamlined narrative for tourism and identity. It redeveloped neighborhoods under the promise of order. Again and again, the visible city became tidier while the invisible story beneath it grew more crowded. And sometimes, the crowding happened very quickly. On the evening of November 9th, 1872, fire broke out in Boston and grew into one of the most destructive urban fires in American history. For nearly 15 hours, flames tore through a major commercial district. Streets that had seemed stable became corridors of heat, smoke, collapse, panic, improvisation, and frantic salvage. Firefighters attempted to halt the spread by blowing up buildings with gunpowder, creating deliberate destruction in order to limit a larger one. Business owners tried to save goods. Looters moved at the edges of chaos. The city's dense built environment became fuel and trap at once. The Great Boston Fire is often remembered as a disaster story, which of course it was. But when viewed through the lens of lost mysteries, it becomes something more intimate and strange. Fire does not only destroy structures, it destroys orientation. Familiar blocks become blankness. Daily routines vanish faster than memory can process them. Records burn. Inventories disappear. Archives become ash. A person who knew exactly where a door, desk, ledger, or staircase had been may return to find not merely ruin, but the breakdown of spatial certainty. That is one reason large urban fires occupy such an eerie place in historical imagination. They create temporary moonscapes in the middle of ordinary civic life. And Boston in 1872 was especially vulnerable in ways that feel almost symbolic. Narrow streets, closely packed buildings, urban congestion, commercial intensity. The very density that made the city prosperous also magnified its risk. Add wind, combustible material, limited firefighting coordination by modern standards, and the result is not just damage, but transformation. The city emerges after the fire with a visible before and after. A district disappears. A replacement future begins pressing forward almost immediately. There is a quiet violence in that rhythm. A fire strips away a built world in hours. Reconstruction begins before grief has fully learned the shape of what was lost. Practicality returns. Plans are made. Insurance, property, finance, engineering, and civic will move in. Streets are rebuilt. Buildings rise. Materials change. Codes evolve. Historians later describe resilience, and they are not wrong. Cities do rebuild. But the language of resilience can sometimes cover the uncanny fact that an entire lived environment ceased to exist in a single night. Imagine the smells of that aftermath. Wet ash, burned paper, masonry dust, charred wood, damp wool, smoke still trapped in broken interiors. Imagine the silence in places where commerce had been constant. Imagine trying to remember whether a certain doorway stood slightly left or right of another storefront, only to find that the landmarks by which memory orientated itself had all been erased together. In a city like Boston, where old streets and inherited patterns carry so much meaning, that kind of erasure is more than economic. It is cognitive. A fire rewrites how a city knows itself. And yet, after enough time, the rewritten version settles into normalcy. Later generations walk rebuilt streets without sensing the absent district beneath their routine. Once again, visible Boston succeeds in visible Boston. The mystery does not vanish, but it changes form. No longer the terrifying unpredictability of flame, it becomes a subtler question. What did this place look like before the break? What social world moved here before these facades? What documents, conversations, and objects were lost, not because anyone intended to forget them, but because a night of heat and wind outran the city's ability to hold on. It is striking how often Boston's lost histories revolve around abrupt transitions like this: water becoming land, a neighborhood becoming a redevelopment zone, an island becoming an institutional edge, a commercial district becoming ash. A modern city does not merely accumulate, it also sheds, sometimes by design, sometimes by catastrophe, sometimes by a partnership of both. The Great Molasses Flood of 1919 belongs to that pattern, though in a tone all its own. At first mention, the phrase can sound almost whimsical to those encountering it for the first time. Molasses, a flood of sweetness, something out of folktale, exaggeration, or local eccentricity. But the event itself was lethal and devastating. In Boston's North End, a massive storage tank holding more than 2.3 million gallons of molasses burst. The contents surged outward in a destructive wave, killing people, injuring many more, smashing structures, and leaving behind a scene so abnormal that it has remained lodged in the American imagination ever since. What makes the disaster especially powerful in a city of lost mysteries is the tension between absurdity and trauma. The substance seems almost too strange for the scale of destruction, and that very strangeness ensured the event would survive not only as history, but as folklore. People remembered stories about the smell, about the stickiness, about residues clinging to places and minds, about rumor expanding what direct witness first supplied. The flood entered that peculiar zone where catastrophe becomes inseparable from the way a city retells it. This is not unusual. Cities metabolize trauma through narrative. But Boston's version feels especially vivid because the material itself was so unlikely. Water floods, fire destroys. Those belong to familiar disaster vocabularies. Molasses does not. It destabilizes expectation. It turns industry into nightmare through a substance associated with kitchens, warehouses, sweetness, commerce, and ordinary use. It reminds people that urban danger does not always arrive in recognized dramatic costumes. Sometimes it waits inside a tank that people have stopped seeing. And that is where the story acquires a deeper resonance. The flood was not only a freak accident in the abstract. It emerged from industrial decisions, engineering failure, and the pressures of wartime production and commerce. A city already full of hidden systems discovered, in the most violent way, that one of those systems had been holding back disaster. The tank was part of modernity's confidence. It stored value. It promised utility. It belonged to an economic machine, until suddenly it no longer did. The aftermath transformed the North End into a landscape of stunned disbelief. Rescue workers struggled through thick brown wreckage. Buildings were damaged. Families were broken. Daily life was interrupted by something almost beyond ordinary language. Even now, descriptions of the disaster carry a trace of astonishment, as if the mind still resists the pairing of material and consequence. That resistance is part of the event's afterlife. The molasses flood lingers because it does what lost mysteries often do. It makes a familiar city briefly seem impossible. It opens a trapdoor beneath common sense. It asks how a great urban center, with all its systems and routines, could produce a scene so bizarre and so deadly. And then, once the wreckage was cleaned, once legal battles and rebuilding and public narration moved forward, the city had to decide how to remember it. Solemnly? Humorously? As corporate negligence? As local legend? As warning? As all of these at once? Boston never entirely chose just one, which means the disaster still drifts between categories. Historical fact, civic trauma, folklore, strange anecdote told to visitors, industrial parable, urban ghost story without ghosts. That ambiguity gives it staying power, and it teaches us something else as well. Lost mysteries do not always depend on incomplete evidence. Sometimes the facts are known. The mystery survives because the event resists emotional simplification. People continue returning to it, not to learn what happened, but to understand what kind of happening it was. Boston specializes in that kind of return. Its best-known histories are often neat enough to teach. Its hidden ones are harder to classify. They ask listeners to remain with contradiction, progress and burial, pride and displacement, commerce and catastrophe, documentation and forgetting, public memory and private grief. The deeper we go, the more the city reveals that its lost mysteries are not separate curiosities. They are a pattern of how urban life makes and unmakes itself, which brings us to a different form of absence, preserved not by rubble or shoreline change, but by frames on a museum wall. There may be no modern Boston mystery more famous than the theft at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, and yet what makes it fit so well inside tonight's wider journey is not merely that it remains unsolved. It is that the museum chose to preserve absence itself. In the early hours of March 18th, 1990, Two men dressed as police officers rang the museum intercom and claimed they were responding to a disturbance. A guard broke protocol and let them in. From there, the sequence is known with chilling clarity. The guards were restrained in the basement. Motion detectors traced the thieves as they moved through the galleries. They removed 13 works of art, taking some from frames that they left behind. They made 2 trips to their car. They departed at 2:45 in the morning. The guards remained bound until police arrived later that morning. There is something almost theatrical about the structure of the theft. Entrance by impersonation, a breach of routine, bound witnesses, movement through darkened galleries. Objects removed from carefully arranged spaces, empty frames remaining to testify, a departure into the night. In narrative terms, it feels complete. We can imagine the sequence. We can reconstruct the route. We know the approximate timing. We know what was taken. And still, the central question remains open. Where did the artworks go? What became of them after Boston woke up to discover that one of the greatest art thefts in history had unfolded in a city museum while most of the city slept? The Gardner theft is a modern lost mystery, not because it lacks detail, but because detail failed to produce closure. The actions are visible enough. The outcome is not. That gives the event a very specific emotional texture. It is neither pure enigma nor solved crime. It is a gap bordered by knowledge. The museum's own account underscores the tactile drama of what happened. Rembrandts were cut from their frames. Vermeer's concert was removed. Degas works were taken. A Chinese bronze beaker was lifted from a table. Manet's Ches Tortoni vanished from the Blue Room. The thieves moved through rooms built for contemplation and transformed them, in just over an hour, into scenes of carefully executed loss. Loss, in a museum, behaves differently than loss elsewhere. When a house burns, an object disappears from daily life. When a neighborhood is demolished, buildings vanish from common use. But when a museum loses a work of art, the absence itself can become institutionalized. The place where the object belonged remains charged. The empty frame or empty wall is not simply a reminder of missing property. It is a visible wound in a narrative of preservation. Museums exist to protect continuity. They gather objects so that time, ownership, neglect, and private accident will not scatter them beyond public reach. A theft violates that promise in a uniquely unsettling way. It suggests that even within architecture devoted to care, disappearance is still possible. And Boston, perhaps more than most cities, knows how to make disappearance linger. At the Gardner Museum, the theft is not buried under later design choices that pretend nothing happened. The memory has been allowed to stay exposed. This is important. Many institutions protect themselves through visual repair. Damage is concealed. Missing things are replaced or visually normalized. But here, the lack remains part of the visitor experience. The museum does not only remember the stolen art, it curates the unresolved condition left behind. That decision turns the entire theft into an architectural mystery. You can stand before what is not there. You can feel the shape of removal. You can experience absence as something designed into the present. In that sense, the Gardner theft belongs naturally beside Boston's buried schools, vanished streets, and transformed shorelines. Once again, the city teaches through what is missing. Once again, an apparently stable cultural surface opens to reveal that continuity was less secure than it seemed. It is tempting, with a case like this, to become obsessed with suspects, motives, organized crime theories, reward amounts, failed leads, and FBI statements. Those details matter, and they explain why the case remains famous. But for tonight, the more interesting question is why the theft feels so deeply Bostonian. Part of the answer lies in the city's long relationship to controlled image and hidden vulnerability. Boston often presents itself as a place of intellect, curation, authority, and inherited seriousness. A museum like the Gardner fits that world perfectly. It promises not only beauty, but guardianship. And yet the theft revealed how thin the line can be between ordered preservation and irreversible disorder. Two men in uniforms, a moment of misplaced trust, and a carefully held collection became a chamber of unresolved memory. That pattern echoes elsewhere in the city. An archived record opens a forgotten story. A construction site reveals a gravestone. A neighborhood that once seemed permanent is cleared. A harbor island that appears scenic turns out to have been a site of confinement and burial. Again and again, Boston's mysteries arise from institutions or landscapes that looked settled until another layer emerged. There is also something about the Gardner case that aligns with sleep history pacing in a particularly elegant way. It is not loud, even though it is dramatic. It unfolds largely in darkness, through small movements, misread signals, and the strange intimacy of empty galleries after hours. It depends on silence. It depends on timing. It depends on the sleeping city beyond the walls. In that sense, it almost narrates itself as a midnight interruption in the larger story of Boston. And perhaps that is why the empty frames remain so powerful. They do not shout. They wait. They let time deepen the mystery rather than diminish it. Many crimes lose intensity as details settle into record. But a theft that leaves behind carefully preserved emptiness can become more evocative with age. The missing works do not simply retreat into the past. Their absence continues acting on the present. New visitors inherit the old loss. People who were not alive in 1990 can still feel something immediate standing before the blank spaces. The city, in other words, found a way to pass unresolved feeling across generations. That is one of Boston's recurring skills. It can make old absences feel current. Still, the Gardner theft is only one chapter in the city's larger pattern of preserved lack. To see how broad that pattern really is, it helps to return for a moment to the ground itself. Buried beneath streets and buildings, Boston keeps finding ways to reveal how ordinary life once looked. And ordinary life, when recovered after centuries, often proves more emotionally mysterious than extraordinary events. A shard of imported ceramic from Puritan Boston may seem modest compared with a stolen Vermeer. But think about what that shard does. It punctures stereotypes. It tells of trade routes and aspiration, of households connected to larger economies, of taste and consumption crossing oceans. It says that the early city was not isolated in the simple way later imagination sometimes prefers. In miniature, it reveals a wider world. The same is true of voting registers, foundations, tunnels, gravestones, and school traces. Each one rehumanizes the city by narrowing our focus from broad legend to lived detail. Who carried the ceramic bowl? Who signed the registry? Who descended the subway stairs when the tunnel was still active? Who walked past the stone that later vanished from view? Who learned Latin where now only traffic and office routines remain? The questions are basic, but they matter because they restore scale. Great cities can become abstract in historical writing. They are discussed through demographics, institutions, political events, and iconic sites. Archaeology and hidden records reverse that process. They take a place famous for major national symbolism and return it to hands, feet, purchases, errands, lessons, and losses. That return can be unexpectedly moving. Boston's hidden histories are not powerful only because they are strange. They are powerful because they remind us how many ordinary lives had to accumulate before the city could become symbolic at all. Under the polished narratives of founders, reformers, industrialists, and celebrated crises lies the dense anonymous labor of people whose names mostly do not headline anything. They lived in rooms later demolished, used paths later filled, handled objects later buried, and died in conditions later smoothed into general history. To call those lives mysterious is not to romanticize them. It is to admit that urban development has a way of turning former certainties into later puzzles. What was once local knowledge becomes archival work. What was once visible becomes inferential. A family route becomes a planning problem. A burial place becomes an accidental discovery. A shoreline becomes a footnote to engineering. A district becomes a before photograph. And in Boston, that process is so dense that the city almost seems to produce mystery naturally. Walk through downtown, and you are moving across compressions. The old Shawmut Peninsula was once shaped by hills and surrounding water in ways modern paving obscures. Landfill altered the map. Commercial expansion rationalized edges. Transportation systems cut new channels through older arrangements. Administrative power rebuilt certain civic spaces, yet none of those later victories fully erase the earlier logic. They simply make it harder to perceive without help. That is why official archaeology matters so much here. It is one of the few practices that refuses to let visible Boston have the last word. A city of hundreds of archaeological sites is a city in active conversation with its own buried evidence. Every excavation, every report, every public history video, every preserved artifact pushes back against the fantasy that the present surface is complete. Even something as apparently straightforward as an abandoned subway tunnel under City Hall becomes, in this light, part of the city's deeper autobiography. The tunnel is not just obsolete infrastructure. It is the fossil of a rhythm. It marks where the city once moved differently. And movement is one of the easiest things for later generations to forget. People remember buildings because buildings can stand. But they often forget flows, how citizens commuted, where goods passed, where school children assembled, where refugees landed, where the poor were sent, where the sick were isolated, where women first entered formal civic records in new numbers, where workers uncovered old graves while trying to lay the future in concrete and steel. Boston's mysteries are frequently mysteries of flow made still. Roots become relics, trade becomes shard, bureaucracy becomes archive, neighborhood life becomes testimony, institutional function becomes ruin or landscaped memory. What once circulated is fixed. And once fixed, it begins speaking in a quieter register than the city's official self-image usually prefers. That quieter register is important because it changes the emotional temperature of history. Rather than the heat of battle or the triumph of civic firsts, it offers slow discovery. Rather than heroic certainty, it offers careful reconstruction. Rather than a clean arc from past to present, it offers layers that do not resolve neatly. In many ways, this is exactly what makes Boston a perfect subject for a fall asleep to historical mystery. The city does not demand adrenaline. It rewards patience. The more slowly you move through it, the more you notice the mismatches between what stands and what stood before, between what is commemorated and what is merely recoverable, between what the city says about itself and what the ground, harbor, and empty frames quietly suggest. So far, we have followed those suggestions into buried infrastructure, institutional islands, a vanished neighborhood, a great fire, a strange industrial catastrophe, and a museum shaped by loss. But there is another thread running through all of them, one that deserves its own attention. Boston repeatedly turned memory into space. Some memories were monumentalized in central districts. Others were exiled to the harbor. Some were erased beneath redevelopment. Some were preserved in archives. Some were left hanging as absences. Some survive only when the city digs into itself. What kind of place does that create over time? Not simply an old city, a selective city. A city where remembering and forgetting were built into the landscape together. And once you see that pattern, almost every part of Boston begins to shimmer with a second meaning. The polished surface is never the whole story. Consider the simple matter of standing near Boston Harbor on a clear day. Ferries move. Wind cuts across the water. The skyline arranges itself in one direction, the islands in another. Tourists photograph views. Runners pass. The scene can feel clean, legible, almost therapeutic. Yet this calm surface depends on a long history of interruption. The harbor was not merely where the city looked outward. It was where the city sorted the risks of being connected to the wider world. Ships brought trade, people, news, disease, labor, and pressure. Every arrival promised value and uncertainty together. That is why quarantine matters so much in harbor history. A quarantine station is a place built on suspicion. It treats movement itself as potentially dangerous. It acknowledges that a city cannot remain open without also inventing thresholds, inspections, delays, and spaces of separation. In Boston, those thresholds often took shape on the islands. This creates a subtle but durable kind of mystery. What did arrival feel like for those who did not step directly into the city but were first diverted, observed, examined, or contained? How many first impressions of Boston were actually impressions of distance, waiting, illness, fear, or bureaucratic control? The city's self-image as a place of arrival becomes more complicated when the first landfall for some people involved quarantine hospitals and marginal terrain. And the same is true for confinement more broadly. Places on the edge accumulate those who cannot be absorbed easily into the center. Deer Island, as we have seen, held indigenous prisoners, famine migrants, the poor, the sick, and prisoners across different eras. But it was not the only space in the harbor where difficult functions settled. The islands collectively formed a geography of managed discomfort. To study them is to realize that Boston's hidden history is not hidden simply because it is old. It is hidden because it forces the city to confront the parts of itself that were organized through removal. There is also something profoundly lonely about institutional islands. A school in a crowded neighborhood remains within hearing range of ordinary life. A prison on an island occupies a different emotional universe. A hospital across water asks the sick and those who care for them to experience distance as part of treatment. A pauper institution offshore turns poverty into geography. The water itself becomes policy. That may be one reason these places so easily fade in public imagination once their original functions end. Their histories were always partly segregated from routine urban experience. When the institutions close, move, or are rebuilt, the public memory attached to them often weakens faster than memory attached to central ceremonial spaces. A harbor island can become a park, a utility site, or a destination for school trips, and the emotional reality of what happened there can soften into a paragraph on a sign. But signs rarely carry the whole weight. To recover that weight, we have to think slowly. We have to picture winters, Transport boats, locked rooms, waiting lines, medical inspections, burial grounds, fog, administrative records, and loved ones kept at a distance by institutional necessity or political choice. Boston's harbor becomes less picturesque under that pressure, but more truthful. And this is where the city's lost mysteries turn from curiosity into moral atmosphere. The question is not simply what happened. The question is, what kind of memory infrastructure a city builds around what happened? Do difficult histories remain peripheral even in recollection? Are they folded into national stories only faintly? Are they preserved in specialist literature while broader public identity remains anchored elsewhere? If so, then forgetting has not been accidental. It has been landscaped. Boston is hardly unique in this, but it is unusually legible once you start looking. The city's famous compactness can deceive. Because so much history is close together physically, it can seem as though Boston offers unusual access to its own past. Walkability produces a sense of coherence. But coherence is not completeness. A visitor can move through some of the most symbolically dense streets in American history and still miss the deeper pattern entirely. They can encounter celebrated memory without touching submerged memory. In fact, the celebrated version may make the submerged one easier to overlook. That is why hidden history work matters so much in Boston. It reopens interpretive space. It says, in effect, yes, the famous story exists, but it never exhausted the city. There were women entering the civic record in newly visible ways. There were burial grounds and gravestones slipping out of sight beneath later construction. There were global trade goods in early Boston households. There were erased working neighborhoods. There were transit routes and physical shorelines that no longer align with modern assumptions. There were islands of confinement and care, and museums whose emptiness became part of their message. As these pieces accumulate, Boston begins to feel less like a fixed legend and more like an ongoing excavation of itself. This matters for another reason as well. Excavation is not only a technical act, it is a storytelling act. Whenever archaeologists, archivists, preservationists, local historians, descendants, or institutions decide to highlight a buried or neglected chapter, they are intervening in the city's narrative balance. They are pushing something back toward visibility. That push is often modest. A public video, a laboratory tour, a database, a museum room, a local article, a recovered artifact. Yet modest interventions can alter the feel of a city over time. They teach residents that beneath the broad slogans lies a more crowded and more human field of memory. The archaeology of Boston is especially good at this because it deals not only in elite objects or spectacular ruins, but in the leftovers of ordinary life. Leftovers are powerful. They resist simplification. A polished monument tells you what a city wanted to honor. A shard, a foundation, a registry, or a tunnel tells you what a city once used and later ceased to notice. The second category can be more revealing than the first. For example, a 300-year-old gravestone found during construction does more than confirm the city's age. It forces the living city into direct contact with the logistical afterlife of death. The dead were not abstractly present in Boston. They were buried somewhere specific, with ritual, expectation, and family memory. Later generations changed the terrain. Roads shifted. Construction advanced. And then, suddenly, a stone returned. This is how buried history works. It waits inside later certainty until some act of modern confidence cuts back into the older arrangement. The same can be said of a lost tunnel. We tend to think of transit as ephemeral because its value lies in movement. Yet once movement stops, the built corridor remains as a kind of mute chronology. An abandoned subway passage under City Hall is not simply a curiosity for urban explorers. It is proof that one version of the city's daily pulse was replaced by another. It marks a former expectation about where people would go, how they would descend, what route felt efficient, which spaces mattered. Infrastructure is social philosophy poured into concrete. When it is abandoned, the philosophy does not disappear. It becomes legible in silence. Boston, with its dense administrative and architectural history, is full of such silences. Some belong to the 19th century, some to the colonial era, some to the 20th. The effect is cumulative. The city becomes not one old place, but many old places nested together, each with its own vanished routines. This nested quality is also what gives Boston's hidden history such unusual narrative momentum. One discovery naturally leads to another because each recovered layer destabilizes the authority of the present surface. Learn that the shoreline has moved, and you begin wondering what else has shifted. Learn that a neighborhood was erased, and you begin asking which current districts conceal similar displacements. Learn that an island was once an internment site or quarantine station, and you look differently at every scenic edge. Learn that masterpieces disappeared from a museum and were never returned, and the city's image of itself as a guardian of culture acquires a tremor. The city does not collapse under that tremor, but it becomes more interesting, and perhaps more honest. There is another hidden mechanism at work here too: names. Boston is a city thick with names that seem durable. Neighborhood names, street names, institutional names, harbor names, hill names, historical labels repeated over centuries. Names create an impression of continuity. They make us feel that if a word survives, the place behind it must have remained broadly intact. But names are often the most misleading form of urban memory. A name can outlive the shoreline it once described. It can outlive the ethnic world that gave it a local accent. It can outlive the buildings that made it meaningful. It can outlive the daily rhythms that once made the name a shorthand for social life. This is especially true in Boston because so much of the city has been rebuilt while retaining an aura of inheritance. The same word appears on a map, but what does it still refer to? The same neighborhood remains, but which version? The harbor island still exists, but what happened there across its different eras? The museum still hangs frames, but what exactly is being preserved now? Art, memory, or the shape of theft? Names reassure. History complicates. That is a good principle to carry through the city. The Freedom Trail, for example, gives Boston an elegant sequence of named sites. It is useful, important, and effective as public history. But it also trains the eye toward a particular architecture of significance. The city begins to seem like a chain of solved meanings. Here is the meeting house. Here is the church. Here is the burying ground. Here is the state house. Here is the story. Move along. Hidden history refuses that cadence. It says the city is not a solved chain. It is a layered field. The road you walk may be on filled land. The district you admire may stand where another community was displaced. The institution you enter may contain a trace of something missing. The island you see from shore may once have held the kinds of people central narratives place elsewhere. The artifact in a case may owe its survival to burial rather than celebration. The gravestone did not stay visible. The tunnel did not stay useful. The fire did not leave every record behind. The flood did not remain a straightforward disaster. The museum did not restore wholeness. This does not make Boston bleak. It makes Boston mature. A mature city is one that cannot be reduced to its preferred myths. And it is often in maturity that the most soothing kind of historical storytelling becomes possible, because mature history allows for ambiguity without panic. We do not have to force every chapter into triumph or scandal. Some stories remain unresolved. Some remain painful. Some remain only partially legible. Some return through soil. Some through oral memory. Some through archival labor. Some through the stubborn emptiness of a frame. That kind of history is ideal for quiet listening because it resembles how memory actually works. Not as a single clean file, but as overlapping layers, occasionally disturbed, never wholly absent. If you imagine Boston sleeping, this becomes easier to feel. Apartment lights go out, offices empty, trains slow, the harbor darkens. Museum galleries rest in stillness. Beneath that quiet, the older city remains. Not active in a supernatural sense, but structurally present. Foundations are still where they were left. Shorelines remain in old maps and soil compositions. Cemeteries leave traces. Institutional records wait in boxes and databases. Families remember street corners no longer recognizable. Empty places in collections still ask to be filled. It is not that the past rises dramatically. It is that the present never fully sealed it away. That may be the deepest mystery of Boston. Not what has disappeared, but why disappearance here so often feels temporary. Let us stay with that idea a little longer, because it leads us back to where Boston's mysteries may be most fundamental. The city changed its own shape, and in doing so altered how later generations would imagine what was possible beneath their feet. When a city expands by filling coves and flattening heights, it does more than gain acreage. It edits perception. It teaches residents to experience fabricated stability as natural terrain. Streets settle. Buildings rise. Utilities follow. Legal boundaries harden. Over time, few people feel the need to remember that an office block or townhouse row might stand where water once reached in. Yet the old geography never completely withdraws. It returns through archaeology, engineering complications, map study, drainage problems, and the strange emotional jolt of learning that the solid city was, in part, assembled from decisions to overwrite wetness with certainty. Boston is one of America's great examples of this urban self-revision. And self-revision, once noticed, behaves like a key. It unlocks other chapters. If the city could make land from water, then perhaps it could also make coherence from displacement. If it could redraw its edge physically, then perhaps it could redraw its moral edge as well. The pattern is not identical, but the habit is familiar. Complex realities become manageable surfaces. A cove becomes a block. A confinement site becomes a scenic destination. A demolished neighborhood becomes a district name surviving in altered form. A hidden tunnel becomes old infrastructure no one thinks about. A registry becomes data unless someone reads the names aloud as lives. This is why the hidden history of Boston can feel almost geological. Layer rests upon layer, and each new level compresses what came before without fully destroying it. The city above relies on the city below, while rarely advertising the dependence. A modern resident may not know the old contours of the Shawmut Peninsula, but their life still unfolds according to choices made when those contours were inconvenient. A family living in a later Boston inhabits not only a place, but a history of solved obstacles, many of which involved burying evidence of what the obstacle had once been. There is something quietly uncanny in that. Not frightening, exactly. More like the realization that certainty is thinner than it appears. Take the old schools and civic records once more. Boston is proud, understandably, of its educational and institutional firsts. But when archaeologists and archivists draw attention to a 17th-century school site or to records of women entering the electorate in 1920, they shift the emphasis from boast to recovery. Suddenly, the story is no longer simply that Boston led. It is that leadership took place in physical rooms, on imperfect streets, amid domestic objects, contested rights, and ordinary human conditions that later had to be reassembled from fragments. Recovery is a humbler verb than celebration, and humility improves historical vision. The city's women's voting registries are especially evocative in this respect. More than 50,000 women registering to vote in Boston after suffrage was secured is not only a democratic milestone, it is a change in urban texture. Each registration marks a person entering the visible machinery of citizenship differently than before. Names, addresses, handwriting, neighborhood patterns, and administrative process all combine to show political transformation at street level. Yet such records can sleep in archives for years without touching the broader public imagination. They remain available, but not vivid. Then someone brings them forward, and a hidden city reappears. That is a recurring miracle of urban history. Not that new facts are always discovered, but that dormant facts can become newly felt. The same is true for old ceramics from Puritan Boston. One could treat them as technical evidence of trade networks and be done with it. But they are more than that. They are proof that domestic life in early Boston was already entangled with wider worlds. A bowl that crossed an ocean changes how we picture a room. A shard changes how we imagine aspiration. Imported wares reveal that even in its stricter and more pious early periods, Boston was materially connected to a larger circulation of goods, styles, and values. In other words, objects resist stereotypes. Cities become legendary by flattening themselves into recognizable roles. Revolutionary city, Puritan city, Brahmin city, immigrant city, academic city, sports city, port city, innovation city. Boston can be all of these and still remain less knowable than the labels imply. Hidden artifacts help by introducing friction. They stop the city from becoming too narratively smooth. And smoothness, in history, is often the beginning of forgetting. This is one reason even small discoveries in Boston can attract outsized fascination. The city is already assumed to be historical, so each new find does not prove age so much as redirect meaning. A gravestone, a tunnel, a foundation, a cache of ceramics, a cluster of records. Each one asks us to reframe what a familiar place has been carrying unseen. That reframing can work at the scale of a building as well. Consider how many structures in Boston appear continuous while having undergone extensive change, replacement, restoration, partial demolition, recontextualization, or adaptation around them. Even when a facade survives, its urban environment may have transformed completely. A church once looked out on one kind of neighborhood and now looks out on another. A civic building once anchored one circulation system and now stands within a new one. A museum once contained a whole collection and now also contains loss. Historic continuity in Boston is real, but it is often continuity by survival through disturbance, not survival through stillness. That distinction matters. A city preserved in amber tells one kind of story. A city preserved through repeated shocks tells another. Boston belongs to the second category. Fire, redevelopment, engineering, migration, institutional change, public health crises, transportation shifts, and cultural reinterpretation all left marks. The mystery lies not in whether these marks exist, but in how selectively they are noticed. Let us think for a moment about public noticing itself. Why do some histories become central while others remain peripheral? Why does one empty tea chest become iconic while another empty frame speaks more quietly? Why does a revolutionary slogan endure while the history of Deer Island remains less widely woven into everyday civic identity? Why does the West End survive more strongly in the memory of displacement than in the material city tourists encounter? Why is the Molasses flood remembered with a mixture of horror and local oddity rather than solely as an industrial warning? Why does a buried shoreline need maps to become emotionally real again? Because cities organize emotion as carefully as they organize traffic. Some stories are useful for belonging. Some are awkward for belonging. Some inspire. Some accuse. Some unite. Some complicate. Some can be taught in 12 minutes to a school group. Some require an hour of slow context before their implications settle in. Public memory tends to favor what can be repeated easily and worn proudly. Boston's hidden mysteries often belong to the opposite class. They resist compression. The story of Deer Island cannot be made comfortable without being falsified. The story of the West End cannot be celebrated without remainder. The story of the Gardner Museum theft cannot be completed because its central absence endures. The story of the buried city keeps multiplying because each layer suggests another one. The Molasses flood is too strange to fit neatly into solemnity and too tragic to fit neatly into anecdote. The Great Fire offers resilience, yes, but only after a district vanished with frightening speed. A city that contains many such stories becomes unusually rewarding to revisit because the past there is not a settled inventory. It is an argument over emphasis. That argument is still visible in how Boston presents itself to newcomers. The official, postcard, and schoolbook city exists. It should. It tells true things. But the unofficial city lives alongside it, constructed from local memory, historical excavation, descendant testimony, and the quiet work of institutions willing to foreground what the polished version omits. The two Bostons overlap, but do not fully coincide. This overlap is perhaps easiest to feel in the North End, where layers of public symbolism and lived neighborhood history crowd against one another. The area can be approached through the Freedom Trail, through food, through immigrant history, through the Molasses flood, through church towers, through working waterfront memory, through hidden burial traces, through ordinary residential life. Each route emphasizes something different. None is false. But some leave deeper shadows than others. The same holds for downtown. Office towers and transit nodes can make the district feel purely functional and current, yet buried beneath the rush are school traces, archaeological finds, forgotten corridors, and older street logics. City Hall may signify modern governance, but beneath and around such civic confidence remain evidence of previous arrangements, some of them quite literally below grade. This is where Boston becomes almost dreamlike in the best historical sense. Not because it ceases to be factual, but because facts begin stacking in ways that ordinary daytime attention cannot hold all at once. Water beneath land, schools beneath offices, tunnels beneath plazas, graves beneath construction, missing art inside intact galleries, lost neighborhoods inside surviving names, islands of suffering beside leisure views. The city starts to resemble one of those layered illustrations where each transparent sheet reveals a different version of the same place. And perhaps that is the right image for bedtime history. Not a city of shocks, but a city of transparencies. Pull back one layer, and another Boston appears. Pull back that one, and there is another still. Some layers are painful. Some are merely strange. Some are beautiful. Some are administrative. Some are tragic. Some are unresolved. But all of them complicate the surface without abolishing it. That may be why Boston remains so compelling, even to people who think they already know it. Familiarity breeds confidence, and confidence often breeds oversimplification. Boston punishes oversimplification gently but persistently. It waits until someone asks a slower question. What was here before? Who was sent away from here? Which names survived after their original worlds changed? What lies under the paving? Which absence has been preserved on purpose? What did the city move to the edge? What did it rebuild too quickly to mourn fully? What does it commemorate, and what does it merely contain? Those questions do not make the city less lovable. They make its love more adult. To love a city, honestly, is to love not only its triumphs, but its omissions, abrasions, evasions, repairs, and buried testimonies. Boston asks for that honesty more than most because its public image is so polished. The cleaner the legend, the more valuable the hidden record becomes. And the hidden record here is rich enough that even after a long night of listening, one feels only partway through it. There is another way to approach Boston's lost mysteries, and it is to think less about dramatic episodes and more about the city's relationship to routine. Routine is what disappears fastest from public memory, even though it occupies most of human life. A revolution is documented. A famous speech is quoted. A theft is investigated. A flood is narrated. But what about an ordinary morning on a wharf that no longer exists? A lesson in a school whose location later had to be searched for? A woman stepping into a registrar's office in 1920 to place her name into a system that had previously excluded her? A patient waiting on an island hospital for news from shore? A family in the West End crossing a familiar block before the language of redevelopment arrived to classify that block as obsolete? A museum guard on a quiet night believing a uniform means safety? A work crew in the present moment uncovering a stone tied to a life from 3 centuries earlier? These scenes are not famous in the same way, but together they may come closer to the truth of Boston than any single canonical event. Cities are mostly made of repetitions. The same path walked many times. The same corner watched in different weather. The same harbor channel receiving ship after ship. The same schoolroom used by one generation after another. The same market district opening each day until one night it burns. The same neighborhood bonds holding until policy tears them loose. The same museum rooms arranged for quiet looking until theft interrupts them forever. When hidden history recovers such repetitions, the city becomes less like a monument and more like a woven fabric. You begin to sense not just what happened once, but what life felt like many times over. That is why archaeology can be so emotionally potent even when its finds seem modest. A ceramic fragment is not dramatic in isolation, but it is a token of repetition. Meals served, objects washed, shelves arranged, imports chosen, households maintained. A gravestone is not just a marker of one death. It points to burial customs, family care, religious language, neighborhood geography, and changing relationships between the living and the dead. A registry entry is not just ink on paper. It is a moment when a person, an address, and a political structure touched each other in a newly consequential way. Routine is where cities hide themselves. And Boston, because of its age and density, has hidden a great deal. Even the city's famous burying grounds teach this if you approach them correctly. Tourists often encounter old stones as atmospheric scenery, evidence that Boston is old and respectable and deeply historical. But old burial grounds were once active civic spaces in the sense that death was close, visible, named, and integrated into daily geography. Over centuries, changes in burial practice, traffic flow, landscaping, and public interpretation altered that intimacy. The dead remained, but the living learned new ways of passing by. When a 300-year-old gravestone emerges during construction, it is partly startling because modern urban life no longer expects the dead to intervene so directly in infrastructure, yet they were always there. The same is true of labor. Boston is frequently represented through its thinkers, reformers, revolutionaries, patrons, planners, and institutional founders. But hidden beneath the city's polished narrative is labor of every kind: digging, filling, hauling, cleaning, carrying, nursing, recording, guarding, ferrying, demolishing, rebuilding. The making of new land required labor. The maintenance of harbor institutions required labor. The removal of neighborhoods required labor. The response to fire and flood required labor. The ongoing care of museums, archives, and archaeological collections requires labor. Many of Boston's mysteries survive only because someone kept, cataloged, or physically encountered what others had ceased to notice. This can change how we think about preservation too. Preservation is often imagined as the defense of obvious landmarks. But in Boston, preservation sometimes begins with admitting that the most meaningful thing in a place may not be the grand facade. It may be the buried evidence under the lot. It may be the oral history of residents displaced from a neighborhood. It may be a set of institutional records showing who was sent to an island hospital. It may be the decision to leave frames empty rather than quietly replace what was stolen in the visitor's imagination. Preservation, in other words, can involve keeping absence legible. That is a sophisticated civic act. Many cities prefer seamlessness. They would rather patch over breaks than display them. Boston does this at times, certainly. But some of its strongest hidden history practices do the opposite. They reveal discontinuity. They say, here the city changed. Here something was lost. Here another layer survives. Here a narrative you thought was complete needs opening again. And once such openings occur, even the skyline begins to look different. A skyline is usually the most superficial image of a city, all outline and confidence. Yet Boston's skyline rises from a terrain and a memory field full of substitutions. Old coves beneath later districts, altered edges, rebuilt commercial cores, transport systems revised, waterfront uses transformed, institutional histories tucked outward toward the harbor. Nothing in the skyline tells you that directly. But once you know it, the towers seem to stand not on unquestioned permanence, but on a stack of prior worlds. This does not make the city unstable in any practical sense. It makes it historically honest. Stability is often the visible result of many past disruptions. Perhaps that is why Boston can feel comforting and unsettling at the same time. Comfort comes from continuity, from brick, stone, names, and walkable scale. Unsettlement comes from realizing how much continuity here was built through change, omission, and layered forgetting. The two feelings do not cancel each other out. They deepen each other. Imagine again the person walking through the city at night. They pass Old City Hall, perhaps unaware of earlier school traces in the area. They move toward Government Center without thinking of abandoned tunnels. They continue toward the North End and think of restaurants, churches, and revolution before they think of exploding molasses. They look across the harbor and see darkness with scattered lights, not necessarily internment, quarantine, burial, or house of correction. They visit a museum in daylight and see elegance, perhaps only slowly absorbing the fact that some of the most famous objects are known there through the shape of their loss. None of this means the walker is ignorant. It means the city exceeds casual perception. Good cities often do. But Boston's form of excess is unusually concentrated. It has so many well-known stories that lesser-known stories can become hidden in plain sight. The city overwhelms simplification, not because the facts are unavailable, but because there are too many important truths competing for the foreground. This is why listening slowly helps. Slow listening imitates excavation. You brush away one layer, then another. You do not rush to declare the city understood. You let contradiction remain. You allow different centuries to speak together. In that slower mode, Boston begins to resemble less a timeline than a tide chart. Certain histories rise into visibility, then recede. Others return after long periods of neglect. Some remain exposed because institutions deliberately keep them visible. Others depend on rediscovery. The city is not a line of progress, but a pattern of exposures. And exposure has consequences. When hidden histories return, they can alter civic ethics. Learning that Deer Island held interned indigenous people and later famine migrants changes how the harbor is felt. Learning that the West End was not simply old, but socially rich complicates easy talk about renewal. Learning that Boston archaeology reveals global trade, old schools, tunnels, and gravestones changes how we think about the depth of everyday life under modern streets. Learning that a museum has preserved emptiness after theft changes how we think about culture as something vulnerable, not merely inherited. Learning that a disaster like the Molasses flood still resists neat categorization reminds us that modern systems can fail in ways memory never fully domesticates. In this sense, Boston's lost mysteries are not merely entertaining or atmospheric. They are corrective. They correct pride when pride becomes too narrow. They correct nostalgia when nostalgia becomes too polished. They correct progress when progress starts pretending it left, no victims at the edge. And they correct historical confidence when confidence forgets the ground can answer back. There is something tender about that correction. It returns us to scale. It reminds us that every celebrated city is also a repository of interrupted lives and half-visible continuities. The more successful a city becomes at packaging itself, the more necessary these hidden layers are. They keep the place from flattening into brand. Boston, to its credit, contains enough institutions and historical workers willing to resist that flattening. Archaeology labs welcome public attention. Museums preserve difficult absences. Park and history materials document island uses that many would rather leave peripheral. Local memory and scholarship keep vanished neighborhoods alive beyond redevelopment renderings. Public records projects make long-sleeping civic transformations newly searchable. Each effort is partial, but together they create a counter-Boston beside the postcard Boston. And perhaps the most interesting thing about this counter-Boston is that it is not anti-memory. It is memory in a different key. Quieter, less ceremonial, more granular, more interested in foundations than facades, more willing to admit that what a city cannot easily celebrate may still be central to what the city really was. That willingness leads us toward the end of tonight's journey, where Boston's separate mysteries begin to gather into one broader insight. The city did not lose its past all at once. It lost parts of it selectively, repeatedly, and often functionally. Some losses were material, some narrative, some emotional, some topographical, some institutional, some recoverable, some ongoing. And yet, again and again, traces remained. Traces remained in soil, in water, in records, in testimony, in architecture, in names, in route patterns, in institutional memory, and in absence itself. This is why Boston's lost mysteries do not finally feel like a collection of isolated curiosities. They feel like a philosophy of urban time. A city, Boston suggests, does not simply move from past to present. It layers, suppresses, exposes, and rearranges. It makes some things central and sends others outward. It celebrates certain origins and allows other beginnings to become specialist knowledge. It fills in literal water and then, in subtler ways, fills in interpretive gaps with cleaner stories than reality perhaps deserves. But it can never finish the job. Something is always left underneath. The underneath matters. Without it, Boston becomes only a polished inheritance. With it, Boston becomes a living argument between memory and utility. Think of how different chapters from tonight now begin to rhyme with one another. The altered shoreline and the lost West End both involve replacement presented as improvement. The harbor islands and the museum theft both involve controlled spaces whose outward order concealed deeper vulnerability. The Great Fire and the Molassez Flood both show how quickly routine urban confidence can collapse into scenes later generations struggle to imagine. The gravestone, the ceramics, the school traces, and the tunnel all reveal that the city's most intimate truths may surface only when the modern world cuts back into what it thought it had surpassed. Even the women's voting registries fit this pattern, because they mark the quiet insertion of lives into civic visibility in ways that later risk becoming abstract unless records are actively reanimated. In all of these cases, Boston appears less like a stable object and more like a palimpsest, a text written over older writing, never entirely able to erase the lines beneath. That is a beautiful image, but it is also a demanding one. It asks us to give up the comfort of single-story history. It asks us to see that memory is political, spatial, and unevenly distributed. It asks us to recognize that what gets buried is not always what mattered least. Quite often, it is what proved most inconvenient to later uses of the city. And yet there is something hopeful here too, because buried does not always mean gone. A gravestone can return. A voting registry can be digitized and searched. An archaeology lab can interpret a shard or foundation for the public. A museum can keep an absence visible rather than pretending repair. A community can continue telling the story of a neighborhood long after its buildings are lost. A harbor island can be read differently once its harder histories are named. Even an old shoreline, if you look carefully enough, can begin to reappear in the mind. This slow return of hidden knowledge may be the gentlest counterforce to forgetting that cities possess. Not total recovery. Not perfect justice. Not complete restoration. Just the refusal to let the final version of a place be mistaken for its only version. Boston needs that refusal because it is so easy to admire the city in broad strokes. It is compact. It is beautiful in parts. It is articulate about its past. It carries prestige. But admiration without excavation risks turning the place into a stage set of American memory. Excavation, literal and metaphorical, restores friction. It gives back weather, labor, exclusion, accident, routine, bureaucracy, and loss. And those things, difficult as they can be, are what make history breathable. A city that contains only heroism quickly becomes unreal. A city that contains ordinary objects, institutional shame, damaged districts, repaired edges, and unanswered questions begins to feel inhabited. Boston is deeply inhabited, not only by the living, but by the lingering structures of earlier lives. That is why, even after hours of quiet attention, the city does not empty out. It grows denser. The more you learn, the more the visible surface becomes translucent. You start sensing where water used to be, where neighborhoods used to cohere, where walls once held paintings that are now elsewhere or nowhere anyone can say, where records sat unnoticed, where ships and disease and refugees crossed into a contested threshold, where old stones waited beneath modern confidence. And then something subtle happens. The city becomes calmer. Not because its history is resolved, but because you stop requiring resolution from every chapter. Some mysteries remain open. Some losses cannot be reversed. Some places can only be revisited through evidence and imagination together. Yet that incompleteness is not failure. It is the normal condition of old cities. They survive not by preserving everything, but by preserving enough traces that later generations may still ask better questions. Boston has preserved many such traces, even when it did so unintentionally. A filled cove preserves a question about what the city chose to become. An island cemetery preserves a question about whom the city kept at a distance. An erased neighborhood preserves a question about what planners failed to value. A burned district preserves a question about what vanished before it could be fully mourned. A flood of molasses preserves a question about the strange forms industrial modernity can take when it breaks. An empty frame preserves a question about culture, trust, and the afterlife of theft. An old registry preserves a question about whose names the city decided, at last, to count. A buried school site preserves a question about how institutional glory outlives material certainty. A tunnel under civic ground preserves a question about prior movement beneath current authority. A gravestone preserves a question about whether the dead ever truly leave the city that builds over them. When placed side by side, These are not just episodes. They are a map of how Boston forgets and remembers. And perhaps that is the final mystery. Not what happened in any one place, but how one city became so practiced at carrying many unresolved pasts at once. As the night deepens, you can imagine Boston settling into quiet, the harbor dark and patient, the streets thinner with traffic, the museum rooms still, the old burying grounds enclosed by iron and shadow, the great redeveloped districts humming more softly, apartment windows blinking out one by one, wind moving over land that was once water, foundations resting on earlier foundations, records asleep in archives, artifacts waiting in drawers, names resting in databases until someone searches, empty frames holding their silence. Above all of it, the modern city remains intact. Below all of it, the older cities remain as well, not fully visible, not fully hidden, just present enough to change the meaning of the surface. And perhaps that is what Boston has always been. Not a city that lost its past, but a city that kept covering it, layer after layer, until the buried and the visible learned to live together. Sometimes uneasily, sometimes elegantly, sometimes in ways that ask difficult moral questions, sometimes in ways that produce wonder. The wonder matters. Because hidden history is not only about exposing damage, it is also about recovering depth. A city becomes more beautiful when it becomes more dimensional. Even sorrow, when honestly held, can add contour to admiration. Boston's lost mysteries do that. They make the city stranger, yes, but also truer. And truth, approached quietly, can be its own form of peace. So if, from now on, you think of Boston, perhaps you will think not only of the familiar monuments and stories, but of the buried shoreline under later streets, the island winter of forced exile, the vanished neighborhood carried in memory, the district erased by fire, the slow stickiness of a disaster that became legend, the museum that keeps faith with what is missing, and the patient work of archaeologists and archivists who keep reminding the city that it has never been only one thing. Because no great city is ever only one thing. It is harbor and margin, pride and omission, brick and landfill, archive and rumor, ceremony and routine, presence and absence. Boston simply makes that doubleness easier to feel than most. And as we leave it tonight, let the city remain in your mind that way, not flattened into one bright tale, but resting in layers, each one quieter than the last, each one still there beneath the next. A city of crypts and classrooms, of coves made solid, of neighborhoods remembered after their walls are gone, of islands that carried the burdens the mainland placed at a distance, of firelight in a vanished district, of brown industrial surf turning streets into disbelief, of frames that hold on to what they can no longer contain, of stones and shards and records waiting underfoot. And somewhere between the visible Boston and the buried Boston, between the city on the map and the city in the ground, between what is proudly told and what is quietly recovered, the lost mysteries remain, not demanding to be solved all at once, only asking to be remembered. Additional night walk, the city beneath the map. If we were to begin again, and this time trace Boston not by monuments, but by the older lines hidden beneath them, we would start with water. Not because water explains everything, but because in Boston, it explains so much that later generations learned to stop seeing. The earliest city did not possess the confidence of the later one. It stood on a peninsula of awkward shape, with narrow access, surrounding tides, marshy edges, and elevations that made some routes difficult and some opportunities obvious. The city had to negotiate with geography before it could dominate it. Modern Boston, by contrast, often feels as if it mastered the argument long ago. Roads are stable. Districts are secure. Valuable land appears self-evident. The water, though present and scenic, seems politely arranged around the city's permanence. Yet that permanence was made. And made land is a peculiar thing in the historical imagination. Once it settles, it behaves like destiny. Buildings rise, generations pass, and what was once a deliberate intervention begins to feel as natural as bedrock. But unlike bedrock, made land contains memory in a different way. It is composed of removal and deposit, of old material moved to create new certainty, of topography edited into utility. In a city like Boston, that means the ground is full not only of foundations and artifacts, but of decisions about what parts of nature no longer fit the city's ambitions. This can sound technical. In truth, it is intimate. Imagine an older Bostonian standing near an edge that no longer exists, a cove that was once water and mud, alive to tide and smell and labor. Boats near it, goods unloaded near it, waste, weather, commerce, voices, gulls, rope, and wet planks. Then imagine that cove slowly ceasing to be an edge at all. Cartload by cartload, engineering phase by engineering phase, it becomes reclaimed ground. Streets appear. Property lines harden. Buildings rise. The old relation to water vanishes from ordinary sight. Children born later never learn the former contour as lived experience. The city has not merely expanded, it has changed what counts as obvious. That transformation repeats, in different forms, across urban history. But in Boston, it feels central because the city's fame for age can obscure the extent to which its modern body is an artifact of alteration. Visitors often arrive expecting preservation. They find preservation, yes, but also a place heavily shaped by reinvention. That tension between apparent continuity and actual revision is one of Boston's most productive mysteries. It is also one reason old maps matter so much here. Maps reveal where confidence is recent. They restore vanished inlets and prior boundaries. They remind us that the city's current legibility was purchased by obscuring older uncertainties. A map from one century can make the next look overconfident. And once you have seen enough of those older shapes, the modern city starts to loosen. Its outline no longer feels inevitable. It feels negotiated. Negotiation is the right word for Boston more generally. The city negotiated with geography, then with trade, then with migration, then with disease, then with poverty, then with industrial risk, then with infrastructure, then with redevelopment, then with memory itself. In each negotiation, something was retained and something set aside. The retained pieces became public identity. The set-aside pieces became tonight's quieter story. This is one reason buried evidence can feel so strangely satisfying. It interrupts the city's confidence with proof of its earlier negotiations. A school foundation says the educational city had once been physically smaller and more vulnerable. A gravestone says the modern grid crossed an older map of death and devotion. Imported ceramics say the supposedly bounded moral city was also a consumer and participant in larger exchange systems. An abandoned tunnel says official space later overwrote prior movement. Even empty museum frames say cultural authority did not guarantee possession. Every trace carries a sentence that begins the same way. It was not always like this. That sentence is one of the great engines of historical wonder. In Boston, it never stops applying. Take a modern office district at dusk, when people spill out onto sidewalks with briefcases, backpacks, coffee cups, and tired expressions. The built environment around them suggests institutional solidity. It implies that work, transit, and property have settled into forms both practical and durable. Yet beneath many such areas lie deeper stories of landfill, demolition, prior uses, and vanished household worlds. A corporate tower can rise where no tower was once imaginable, not because the city naturally evolved there, but because the ground itself was reauthored to invite such futures. This raises a subtle question. When a city changes its own terrain so thoroughly, what happens to memory that was once attached to the old terrain? Part of it moves into text, deeds, maps, engineering records, newspapers, reports. Part of it moves into objects, shards, stones, buried timbers, foundations. Part of it moves into habit and speech for a while, then fades. And part of it disappears so effectively that only specialists later suspect there was more to know. That last category is especially important. Not every lost mystery announces itself dramatically. Some survive only as thin oddnesses. A place name that no longer quite matches its environment, a sudden inconsistency in street patterns, a persistent engineering complication, a rumor that something old was found here once, a local story about what the ground used to do after rain. These are small signs, but in an altered city they matter. They are the afterlife of transformed landscape. Boston's hidden history teaches us to respect such small signs. It also teaches us that the city did not bury only its own terrain. It buried versions of time. Walk through the present city quickly and you get chronology and slogans. Slow down and chronology thickens. A 17th century school may be conceptually near a 20th century tunnel, which sits conceptually near a 19th century fire district, which sits conceptually near a 1990 museum theft, which sits conceptually near colonial and 19th century harbor institutions. Boston's layers do not line up in tidy separations. They overlap spatially and emotionally. One century bleeds under another. This is why night is such a useful, imaginative setting for the city. Darkness smooths visual clutter and lets older structures of feeling come forward. You notice outlines and absences. You think more about what cannot be immediately seen. The harbor becomes not just beautiful but withholding. Brick becomes not just picturesque but accumulative. Empty windows look like pauses in a longer sentence. A plaza may begin to feel like a cover over something deeper, which in Boston it often is. The city beneath the map is not accessible in a single tour. It emerges in fragments. But fragments are enough. A good fragment changes what the whole looks like. That is what the archaeology of Boston repeatedly demonstrates. A recovered object need not explain everything. It only needs to break the illusion that the visible city is self-sufficient. Once that illusion breaks, the mind starts working differently. You begin wondering not just what is here, but what had to be displaced, removed, buried, or forgotten to make here look so coherent. And that wondering is not hostile to the city. It is one of the highest forms of civic attention. Cities deserve admiration for what they build. They also deserve scrutiny for what their building conceals. Boston is strong enough to withstand both. In fact, it becomes more compelling under both at once. The skyline gains complexity when you remember the coves. The streets gain poignancy when you remember the neighborhoods that did not survive their planning diagnoses. The harbor gains moral gravity when you remember the institutional lives kept at its edges. The museum gains intensity when you remember what is still missing. The archives gain warmth when you remember that names resting quietly in records were once spoken in kitchens, on docks, in tenements, on ferries, at school desks, and in rooms now gone. Perhaps that is why the hidden city rarely feels dead. It feels unfinished. Unfinished not because the work of historians and archaeologists is inadequate, but because no city can ever fully close the distance between lived experience and later understanding. There will always be more routine than record, more feeling than inventory, more silence than explanation. Yet Boston's particular density of traces allows us to get unusually close, close enough to feel how the map changed, close enough to sense water under paving, close enough to see that some of the most stable-looking places in America stand on acts of radical revision. And once you feel that, the rest of Boston's mysteries become easier to understand. The city was always willing to reshape itself. Why would memory be exempt? Additional night walk. The harbor of distance, if the city beneath the map is one hidden Boston, then the harbor of distance is another. Distant is rarely neutral in urban history. It can soothe, isolate, segregate, protect, delay, dignify, or neglect depending on who controls it and who must cross it. In Boston Harbor, distance often became administrative. The islands were near enough to serve the city and far enough to spare it from constant, intimate contact with some of the people and conditions it produced. That pattern deserves slower attention than it usually receives. A quarantine station may sound like a purely medical arrangement, but it is also a moral and emotional arrangement. It says that a city's openness must be filtered through suspicion. It acknowledges danger, but distributes the burden of that danger unevenly. Those arriving by sea do not enter Boston on equal terms. They can be paused, examined, detained, diverted. Their first experience of the city may not be welcome or belonging, but waiting. For the healthy and established residents on shore, quarantine offers reassurance. For the arriving poor, sick, or uncertain, it may feel like the city's first lesson in hierarchy. Harbor hospitals deepen that lesson. Illness on an island is not the same as illness in a neighborhood. Water changes the emotional geometry of care. Even when treatment is earnest, the patient is removed from ordinary civic life. Relatives travel differently. News arrives differently. Burial, if it comes, takes place at a distance from the daily streets where memory would otherwise settle. The administrative logic may be clear. The human experience is lonelier. Boston's island histories retain that loneliness. De Deer Island, in particular, gathers it across centuries. We have already traced some of its uses, but it is worth returning to the island once more, because repetition itself is revealing. Places do not receive such different institutions by accident. A society chooses where to locate what it cannot easily place at its center. Again and again, Deer Island became such a location. Indigenous prisoners in the 1670s, famine refugees and the sick in the 1840s, paupers, prisoners, military installations, sewage infrastructure, different populations, different rationales, different historical contexts. Yet a common logic persists. The island as managed edge, that continuity is one of Boston's quietest and harshest truths. The city's margins were not empty. They were used. And used in ways that reveal what kinds of suffering or inconvenience the city preferred to process across water. This is not an accusation detached from context. Every port city created systems of distance. What matters in Boston is how little those systems enter the city's most familiar self-portrait. The islands appear in tourism, recreation, environmental history, military history, and occasionally in local lore. But the fuller pattern requires synthesis. You have to place internment beside quarantine, burial beside utility, migration beside punishment, care beside exclusion. Then the harbor changes. It stops being merely scenic and becomes diagnostic. The same waters that carried commerce also carried categories. Who belongs in the center? Who waits at the edge? Who is protected by distance? Who is defined by it? The harbor was a living mechanism for those distinctions. And still, in the present, the islands can seem calm. That calm is not false. Landscapes are capable of holding serenity and historical violence at once. People walk, fish, look out over water, and experience genuine peace on places that once held grief, coercion, or abandonment. But peace in such places is enriched, not weakened, by awareness. To know what happened there is not to ruin the view. It is to understand what the view has outlived. Boston's hidden history asks for precisely that kind of layered seeing. An island park can also be a former institutional threshold. A shoreline path can also trace the afterlife of confinement, a harbor breeze can move across buried names, a ferry ride can cross an old line between the commemorated city and the managed city. There is another dimension here as well: weather. Island histories are always partly weather histories. Winter on Deer Island in 1675 and 1676 was not merely inconvenient. For the indigenous people interned there, it was fatal for many. Exposure, inadequate shelter, hunger, and removal combined into catastrophe. The water surrounding the island intensified vulnerability. Distance was not abstract, it was cold, it was logistical, it was embodied. The same is true in gentler ways for later migrants, patients, and confined populations. Fog delays, rough seas unsettle. Salt air corrodes. Travel depends on boats, schedules, and tides. Institutions placed on islands are therefore institutions filtered through climate and transport. Even when they are close on a map, they are far in daily feeling. That far feeling helps explain how such places become hidden in civic consciousness. They were always somewhat separate. Their stories were experienced by fewer people directly. Their burdens fell on populations with less narrative power. When later infrastructure or public uses transformed the sites, there was less pressure to keep the harder layers central. Distance in administration became distance in memory, yet memory can cross back. Official park and history materials, local scholarship, and the work of interpretation make sure of that. They do not erase what happened, but they prevent the islands from becoming purely decorative in the public imagination. This is a gift to the city, even if it is an uncomfortable one. It allows Boston to encounter itself more fully. It reminds the mainland that some of its most revealing truths were always just offshore. And perhaps this is the right way to think about all of Boston's lost mysteries. They are not gone because they were minor. They are hidden because they occupied structural positions the city found easier to soften, peripheralize, or narrate incompletely. The islands, in that sense, are not exceptions. They are the harbor-shaped version of a wider habit. The West End was softened into redevelopment language. The altered shoreline was normalized into land. The city's buried material life was compressed beneath sidewalks and basements. The Great Fire was absorbed into resilience. The molasses flood drifted into a half-folkloric register. The Gardner theft became a carefully contained wound within a museum. Again and again, Boston converted rupture into manageable public form. But manageable is not the same as resolved. That is the distinction to remember as we approach the close. A city can manage memory without fully understanding it. It can keep a story available without letting it shape the dominant self-image. It can interpret an event while still muting its more troubling implications. Boston has often done exactly this. Yet because it is also a city rich in archives, preservation, archaeology, and local devotion, the muted implications never disappear altogether. They wait for listeners willing to stay longer than the brochure, the plaque, or the standard walking route, and when listeners do stay, the harbor begins to answer. It answers not with one unified message, but with a collection of returns. Return to the internment winter. Return to the famine hospital and cemetery. Return to the poorhouse and prison. Return to the idea that the city's beauty depended partly on removing certain experiences from central view. Return to the fact that the most exposed places often held the people with the least protection. Return to the realization that beneath the bright story of Boston as cradle, beacon, or intellectual capital lies another Boston that organized hardship carefully. Often geographically, that realization need not make the city smaller. It can make it wiser. A wise city is one that knows the edges help build the center. Boston's harbor did exactly that, and on quiet nights, with the mainland lights behind you and the wind moving across dark water, it is possible to feel those edges not as distant curiosities, but as essential rooms in the larger house of the city. Additional night walk. What the city chooses to keep by the time we have followed Boston through buried land, hidden infrastructure, harbor margins, erased neighborhoods, fire, flood, and theft, a final question begins to take shape. What does the city choose to keep visible when it cannot keep everything? This is not only a practical question, it is a cultural one. Every city preserves selectively, whether through monuments, museums, street names, archives, zoning, adaptive reuse, oral tradition, or educational emphasis. Selection creates identity. It tells residents what kind of inheritance they are expected to share. But selection also leaves shadows, and Boston's shadows are unusually articulate if you learn how to read them. Some things the city keeps because they are foundational to civic myth. Some because they are architecturally distinguished. Some because descendants and communities fight for them. Some because institutions invest in them. Some because they are useful for tourism. Some because they can absorb complex history into a manageable public script. And some things the city keeps almost accidentally: a shard in the ground, a record in a drawer, a tunnel under a building complex, a cemetery at the margin of ordinary movement. An island whose uses outlasted the comfort of remembering them, an empty frame that became too meaningful to fill with a substitute story. Accidental preservation is one of the most haunting forms of urban memory because it bypasses intention. It reminds us that the city's official priorities were never the only forces deciding what survived. Soil chemistry preserves, waterlogged conditions preserve, bureaucratic habits preserve, neglect preserves, inertia preserves. Loss itself preserves by freezing attention on what is no longer there. Boston contains all these modes at once. This is why its hidden histories feel so textured. They are not all noble recoveries or tragic omissions. Some are the byproducts of institutions. Some of engineering, some of care, some of failure, some of chance. The city is less an archivist than a complicated environment in which preservation and disappearance operate through many channels simultaneously. That complexity appears clearly in the contrast between commemoration and evidence. Commemoration is intentional. It places a plaque, shapes a tour, restores a facade, curates a room, names a trail. Evidence, by contrast, may emerge without ceremony. A grave marker appears during construction. A domestic object surfaces in excavation. A registry database becomes searchable after long dormancy. An abandoned transit route is rediscovered by curiosity. A missing work of art is remembered through the frame that still outlines its absence. Commemoration says, remember this. Evidence says, this was here whether or not you remembered. Boston's strongest lost mysteries often live at the point where those two forms meet. The city may not have intended to foreground a certain buried fact, but once recovered, that fact changes the meaning of what is already commemorated. The official story must widen. The polished narrative has to make room for the stubborn trace. This widening is one of the healthiest things an old city can do. Without it, history hardens into self-congratulation. With it, history becomes a conversation between pride and evidence. Boston needs both because it genuinely has much to admire and much to reconsider. It has intellectual, political, and architectural significance. It also has a record of displacement, managed suffering, selective memory, and abrupt urban transformation. The hidden city does not cancel the famous city. It teaches the famous city proportion. Perhaps the best example of this proportional correction is the West End. For planners in one era, the neighborhood could be summarized through deterioration and obsolescence. For residents and later historians, that summary missed the richness of social life and the violence of removal. Evidence in this case was not mostly archaeological. It was testimonial, visual, communal, and ethical. The hidden value of the neighborhood had to be argued back into the city's memory. Once argued, it became impossible to think about urban renewal in exactly the same innocent way. The Gardner Museum theft performs a similar correction on a different scale. Museums seem like places of successful preservation. They are, until they are not. The theft exposed fragility inside authority. The empty frames turned that fragility into a permanent part of the museum's identity. Here again, the visible story had to widen. The museum was no longer only a container of treasures. It was also a keeper of loss. And then there are the harbor islands, which correct Boston's center by insisting that the city cannot be understood only from within its most celebrated streets. To understand Boston fully, you have to cross water mentally, if not physically. You have to go to the edges and ask what the center exported there. The city that emerges from all these corrections is not a lesser Boston. It is a denser one, denser in conscience, denser in texture, denser in contradiction, denser, therefore, in truth. As we draw toward a close, it is worth noticing how often Boston's hidden stories involve people or things that were expected to stay put and did not. Water stayed in place until land replaced it. Neighborhoods looked rooted until policy cleared them. Art hung safely until it was carried into the night. Archives slept until digitization reawakened them. Grave markers rested until construction disturbed them. Transit paths served until they fell silent. Islands held one institutional role until they were assigned another. This repeated instability is not random. It is the signature of a city always negotiating its own meaning. Boston has long been too valuable, too symbolic, too pressured, and too adaptive to remain still. But adaptation leaves residues. That is what tonight's journey has really been about. Residues, not simply what vanished, But what remained after vanishing? A changed outline, a civic argument, a database, a commemorative wound. A neighborhood remembered most fiercely by those removed from it. A harbor view carrying more than scenery. A subtle unease under places otherwise presented as settled. These residues are enough. They do not give us total possession of the past, but they prevent total loss. And perhaps preventing total loss is the most any city can hope for. Boston has done this imperfectly, unevenly, sometimes accidentally, sometimes through admirable effort. Yet the result is still remarkable. The city remains open to reinterpretation. New listeners, new readers, new walkers, new excavations, new archival projects can all alter what feels central. The buried city is not finished speaking, neither are the harbor margins, neither is the memory of the West End. Neither are the empty frames. That ongoingness is strangely comforting. It means the past has not been sealed beyond relationship. It means that even where justice cannot be completed, attention can still be deepened. It means that a city may become wiser long after the events that first wounded or shaped it. So when Boston sleeps, it does not sleep as a single story. It sleeps as layers held in temporary peace, the celebrated and the neglected, the documented and the half-recovered, the proud and the painful, the brick city and the filled city, the mainland city and the island city, the city of artifacts and the city of absences. And in that layered sleep, perhaps Boston teaches one last lesson. History is not only what a place remembers. History is also what a place keeps making possible to remember later. Boston still makes much possible. Through its archaeology, its museums, its records, its local memory, its preserved wounds, and even through the odd returns produced by construction and chance, it continues offering evidence that the visible city is only part of the inheritance. That is why the lost mysteries endure. Not because they are unsolved in the sensational sense, though some are, but because they remain available to deepen the city each time someone asks the slower question, what lies beneath this surface? Tonight, Boston has given several answers: buried land, buried objects, buried roots, buried names, buried neighborhoods, buried grief. And sometimes, preserved emptiness standing where beauty used to hang, all of it still there, in one form or another, shaping the city that rose above. If you listen closely enough, that may be the softest and strangest truth of all. A city never fully escapes what it built over. Additional night walk. A walk through the overwritten city. Let us imagine one final walk, this time not organized by chapter title, but by movement itself. We begin in the oldest parts of Boston, where the temptation is always to believe that age has been neatly preserved. Brick facades, narrow lanes, old meeting houses, cemetery stones, and heavily interpreted sites encourage confidence. The city appears to cooperate. It presents its historic face directly. Yet even here, the layers do not sit obediently. Colonial memory overlaps with immigrant memory. Sacred ground overlaps with tourist movement. Buried domestic life overlaps with public monument. The effect is not false, but it is curated. Now, continue walking. As you move, think of the hidden school beneath later civic life. Think of young students in a much smaller town, in a place later swallowed by larger municipal functions and altered urban design. Think of the long institutional pride attached to such origins, and then the irony that material certainty about the earliest site had to be sought archaeologically. Boston has always excelled at turning intellectual inheritance into civic prestige, but prestige on its own does not preserve floorboards. Turn again and continue. You cross areas where official business now dominates. The city speaks in concrete, offices, signage, security, and transit logic. Yet beneath that order may lie abandoned routes and older movement systems. A tunnel under City Hall is not simply a forgotten passage. It is a reminder that every administrative present eventually inherits an infrastructural past. People once hurried there with purposes no longer active. A corridor that once pulsed with circulation became stillness under authority. The modern civic center is built, in part, over former expectations of how bodies should flow. Keep walking, the streets open, then tighten, then curve unexpectedly, as Boston streets often do. Their irregularity is one of the city's charms, but charm can obscure cause. Old topography, older property lines, inherited improvisations, and layered expansions all contribute to those patterns. Even when roads are rebuilt, the logic beneath them can remain ancient in fragments. Somewhere below the visible paving, older boundaries still exert influence. The city's famous walkability, then, is not only a present amenity, it is also an archive of earlier constraints. Head toward the water in your mind. The harbor glitters if it is day, darkens if it is night, but in either case, it tends to invite broad emotion. Freedom, trade, arrival, wind, view, distance. Boston understands how to aestheticize its edges, yet those same edges once received the city's more difficult functions: quarantine, internment, burial, correction, poverty, illness. The water did not merely frame the city. It carried away its troubling proximities. Pause there, try to see both harbors at once: the visible harbor of ferries, parks, and skyline photographs, and the remembered harbor of waiting rooms, sick wards, transport boats, administrative lists, and islands where people were placed because the center did not know what else to do with them. That double vision is one of Boston's great hidden disciplines. The city becomes truer when two versions are allowed to coexist, rest turn inland. Move through a district shaped by fire once and commerce many times. Imagine the Great Boston Fire not as a neat historical episode, but as a sensory break in the city's confidence. Hours of flame, collapsing structures, gunpowder detonations used in desperate attempts to arrest the spread, goods dragged through smoke, ledgers burned, corners rendered unrecognizable. Then imagine the rebuild. New materials, new codes, new facades, new certainty. Cities are skilled at presenting reconstruction as destiny. But for those who stood in ash, nothing would have felt destined. It would have felt abrupt, raw, and terribly open. Walk further. In the North End, think about how easily different layers can compete for attention. To one person, the district means the revolution. To another, Catholic processions and immigrant streets. To another, family restaurants and pastry windows. To another, the molasses flood. That is the brilliance and difficulty of Boston. The same place can host multiple dominant stories depending on who is looking. Hidden history does not cancel the others. It simply refuses to let one version monopolize the emotional field. Now let the molasses flood enter the scene, not as a comic local anecdote, but as a shattering industrial accident whose material absurdity made it unforgettable. A massive tank, a failure of confidence, a wave no urban resident would have expected, rescue and ruin in thick brown aftermath. Here again, the city's hidden truth is that modern systems are often trusted until the instant they become impossible. Before the flood, the tank belonged to ordinary industrial logic. After the flood, it belonged to civic legend. The transition from overlooked infrastructure to permanent memory happened in minutes. Continue, at some point, every walk through Boston becomes a walk through neighborhoods that survived, changed, or were recoded by planners. Think then of the West End, not only as a case study, but as a lost atmosphere. The smell of hallways, the sound of conversations from windows, the particular network of obligations and familiarity that allowed one crowded urban neighborhood to function as a home rather than merely as housing stock. Redevelopment reports could classify, photographs could document demolition, officials could promise modernization, but none of that language could fully carry what it meant for a community to lose its spatial grammar all at once. This is why the West End still matters. It demonstrates that what a city destroys may be more socially intricate than what it builds in its place. The replacement can be cleaner, larger, more profitable, more legible to planners, and still leave behind a deficit of human density that statistics cannot measure. The hidden mystery here is not where the buildings went. It is how a city could recognize physical aging while missing social intelligence. Walk still further. Enter the museum. The Gardner Museum is full of beauty, atmosphere, and deliberate arrangement. It is also full of trust tested by time. The theft in 1990 did not merely remove objects. It inserted vulnerability into the institution's identity. Empty frames remain where paintings once hung. This is not simply evidence of crime. It is evidence of a philosophical decision not to mask the wound. Many cities restore surfaces whenever they can. The Gardner chose, in effect, to keep the break visible. Visitors are asked to inhabit loss rather than step around it. There is profound dignity in that. And it echoes the rest of Boston's hidden city. Better to leave some absences legible than to let the present become falsely seamless. This principle applies just as strongly to archaeology. A city that acknowledges buried schools, buried domestic objects, buried graves, and buried route systems is a city willing to admit that its current form is neither singular nor self-originating. The present did not bloom from nowhere. It sits on arrangements made by earlier people under different pressures. When artifacts surface, they challenge the vanity of the current moment. They say, "We were here too." Perhaps that is the quiet, democratic power of hidden history. It expands the cast. Famous cities tend to narrow their cast over time. They elevate the most photogenic, influential, or narratively useful actors. Hidden history reverses that pressure. Suddenly the city belongs again to patients, migrants, guards, dock workers, household shoppers, imprisoned people, school children, registrars, displaced tenants, archaeologists, and anonymous dead. Their traces may be faint, but faint traces can still rearrange moral perspective. Boston, by virtue of its extraordinary archive of surfaces and subsurfaces, offers many chances for such rearrangement. And that may be why it works so well as a place to think slowly before sleep. The city does not demand a verdict. It asks for layered attention. You can hold admiration and discomfort together. You can acknowledge grandeur and omission without forcing either one to win. You can let unresolved cases remain unresolved. You can let vanished neighborhoods remain irrecoverable in material terms while still insisting they mattered. You can let a harbor view remain beautiful while also knowing what kinds of suffering crossed or waited upon that water. This is mature historical feeling, not cynicism, not romantic innocence, something steadier. Boston earns that steadiness because it rewards listeners who can tolerate more than one truth at a time. As the walk ends, imagine looking back across the city from a point where the skyline is visible, but individual details soften. From that distance, Boston can seem perfectly whole. Its contours gather nicely. The old and new fit together at a glance. The harbor holds it. Lights mark its streets. It looks complete. But now, because of everything we have followed tonight, the completeness cannot quite persuade you. You know there are missing paintings inside intact walls. You know there are erased neighborhoods inside surviving district names. You know there are dead beneath transformed land. You know there are patients and prisoners and refugees in the history of islands now encountered as landscape. You know there are objects in drawers and labs that speak for rooms no longer standing. You know there are roots below current roots. You know there are former shores beneath solid blocks. And with that knowledge, the city becomes not less itself, but more. More layered, more difficult, more generous to reality. A city finally worthy of its own age. Additional closing. The gentle persistence of the past before we finally let Boston go quiet. There is one last quality worth noticing. For all its changes, the city has never entirely stopped receiving messages from its own past. Some arrive dramatically through famous thefts, publicized discoveries, or unforgettable disasters. Others arrive softly, through an artifact cleaned in a laboratory sink, through a registry name appearing on a screen, through the recognition that a current lot line once bordered water, through an old family recalling where a bakery, church, or stoop once stood in the West End, through a park interpreter naming what happened on an island that the breeze might otherwise make seem innocent, through the unsettling elegance of an empty frame left open to time. These messages matter because they keep Boston from becoming complacent about its own story. Complacency is the great temptation of well-known cities. Once a place has been admired long enough, it can begin to mistake recognition for understanding. Boston has been recognized for centuries. It has been quoted, toured, painted, filmed, celebrated, argued over, studied, and marketed. Yet recognition is not the same as depth. Hidden history keeps supplying depth where recognition alone would flatten. And depth changes the emotional texture of memory. A shallow civic memory asks only for applause or condemnation. A deep civic memory asks for attention. Boston's lost mysteries belong to the second category. They invite attention because they are not reducible to a slogan. Each one alters several things at once. Deer Island changes how we think about the harbor, public health, colonial violence, migration, and civic marginality. The West End changes how we think about planning, housing, belonging, and the cost of modernization. The buried city changes how we think about topography, archaeology, and the gap between institutional prestige and material continuity. The Great Fire changes how we think about commerce, fragility, and urban reinvention. The molasses flood changes how we think about industrial confidence and the way trauma slides into folklore. The Gardner theft changes how we think about preservation and the long half-life of unresolved absence. That is a remarkable range for one city to hold. But perhaps all old cities hold such range if examined patiently enough. Boston simply offers it in unusually compressed form. The city is small enough for layers to crowd one another, old enough for the layers to matter, and famous enough that the hidden ones produce a sharper contrast. The result is almost paradoxical. Boston is one of the most narrated places in America, and for that very reason it can still surprise us by how much of itself lies in quieter channels. Quieter channels are often the most enduring. Monuments can be ignored once they become too familiar. Public myths can harden into background noise, but a hidden layer, once noticed, keeps working on the imagination. You do not easily forget that a city made land from water and then taught later citizens to walk it as if it had always been there. You do not easily forget that one harbor island served, in different eras, as a site of internment, quarantine, care, burial, punishment, and sanitation. You do not easily forget that a neighborhood could be judged obsolete while remaining vivid in the memory of those who lost it. You do not easily forget that a tank of molasses could destroy lives and then linger in the culture as if trying to decide whether it was nightmare or legend. You do not easily forget a museum that keeps absence visible instead of replacing it with a comforting illusion. In that sense, Boston's hidden history is not fragile at all. It persists precisely because it complicates the smoother image. Complication, once felt, is hard to surrender. And that is a good thing because every city deserves to be understood beyond its most flattering outline. Boston's outline is handsome enough. Brick, domes, harbor light, old institutions, compressed streets, polished memory. But outlines do not tell us who was pushed to the edge, who was counted late, who was buried under later certainty, who lost a neighborhood to efficiency, who entered a museum and never returned the art, who waited on an island in winter, who crossed a former shoreline without knowing it, who handled an imported bowl centuries ago in a house now long gone. For those truths, we need interiority. Tonight, interiority has taken the form of layers. Lover of land, lot of labor, lover of migration, lot of confinement, lot of commerce, lot of fire. Layer of accident, ladder of theft, ladder of memory trying, imperfectly but persistently, to stitch them together. If there is peace in such a city, it is not the peace of simplicity. It is the peace of accepted complexity. Boston does not become restful because every question is answered. It becomes restful because the questions themselves settle into proportion. We do not need to master them all tonight. We only need to know they are there, beneath and around the more familiar version of the place, giving it gravity. Gravity is perhaps the right final word, not heaviness alone, though some chapters are heavy, not grandeur alone, though Boston certainly has grandeur. Gravity in the sense of depth that pulls attention downward, toward what supports the surface and toward what the surface has sometimes tried to conceal. A city without gravity is easy to consume and easy to forget. Boston, at its best and strangest, resists both. It asks to be walked more slowly, read more carefully, and remembered more honestly. So as sleep draws closer, imagine the city once more in layers of quiet. Below the pavement, old ground conditions and buried traces. Within archives, names resting until someone searches them. Across the harbor, islands holding histories, still capable of changing the mainland's self-understanding. Inside museums, beauty interrupted by the shape of loss. Within remembered neighborhoods, lives still ordered by blocks and stoops long erased from the physical city. And above all of it, the present Boston continuing as cities do, working, adapting, commuting, expanding, repairing, and telling stories about itself. The stories will continue. Some will remain famous, some will remain hidden a while longer, some will rise unexpectedly when a foundation is dug or a file is opened or a local memory refuses to fade. That too is part of the city's rhythm. Boston does not finish remembering. It remembers in installments. Tonight we have listened to several of them, and if we leave the city with a little more uncertainty than we began, that may be the most faithful result possible. Because uncertainty, handled calmly, is not ignorance. It is respect for the scale of what one place can contain. Boston contains a great deal. A visible city of monuments, institutions, and practiced pride. An invisible city of edges, losses, routines, and returns. A city above ground, a city below ground. A city on maps, a city in records, a city in memory, a city in absence, and somewhere among those versions, moving softly between them, are America's lost mysteries. Not lost because they vanished beyond reach, but lost because they sank below the level of ordinary attention until someone chose to look again. We have looked again tonight. Now let the streets grow quiet. Let the harbor darken. Let the islands drift back into silhouette. Let the museum rooms hold their stillness. Let the old neighborhood voices soften into distance. Let the buried shoreline rest under modern stone. Let the records sleep in their boxes and servers. Let the city keep its layers. And let Boston remain what it has perhaps always been. A place where the past does not disappear, but waits patiently beneath the next version of the world. Final reflection. The city that keeps returning there is something fitting about ending with return. Boston is a city that returns to itself constantly, though never in exactly the same form. It returns through anniversaries, restorations, archives, neighborhood arguments, school lessons, museum tours, family stories, local obsessions, and the occasional shock of a buried object brought into daylight. But each return changes the city slightly, because no return comes to the same Boston twice. The place keeps moving even as it keeps looking backward. That motion backward and forward at once may be the truest rhythm of the city. A child learns a famous revolutionary story in school, then grows older and discovers the West End. A visitor comes for old churches and red brick, then learns about Deer Island. Someone jokes about the molasses flood, then reads enough to feel the tragedy beneath the strangeness. A museum goer admires the gardener's atmosphere, then finds themselves thinking more about what is missing than what is present. A resident hurries over ground they assume is settled, then sees an old shoreline map and realizes the city underfoot was once something else altogether. Each discovery is a return, but also a correction. And perhaps that is how mature historical identity is formed, not by replacing old stories with new ones, but by letting the city become porous enough for both to exist together. Boston does not need to surrender its famous past in order to admit its hidden one. It only needs to stop pretending the famous past was ever complete. The hidden city has always been there, not as a rival narrative, but as the supporting depth without which the familiar version becomes too thin to bear its own weight. Consider how different Boston would feel if all the quieter layers were removed from thought. No buried school traces, no archaeological shards, no gravestones resurfacing unexpectedly, no altered shoreline remembered. No harbor islands with painful histories at the edge of civic attention. No West End warning. No great fire taking an entire district into smoke. No flood so improbable it still sounds invented. No museum wound left visible. Without those things, Boston might still be attractive, important, and old, but it would not feel fully real. Reality in cities depends on remainder. There must be something left over that resists the neat summary. In Boston, there is a great deal left over. Remainder in the ground. Remainder in district names, remainder in public records, remainder in family memory, remainder in empty space, remainder in the stubborn survival of questions. That stubborn survival is deeply reassuring in its own way. It means the city has not been emptied by interpretation. There is still room for inquiry, still room for revision, still room for moral rebalancing, still room for descendants, researchers, residents, and listeners to shift what feels central. Many places fear that kind of revision because they think it weakens identity. But Boston's identity is strong enough to be widened. In fact, it becomes stronger through widening, because a city that can face its buried, erased, and unresolved layers without losing itself has achieved something more durable than civic polish. It has achieved depth. Depth is not always comfortable. Yet comfort is overrated in history. What matters more is whether a place can continue yielding truth without turning brittle. Boston can. It yields truth from archives and excavation, from topography and testimony, from institutions that preserved absence, and from landscapes whose scenic calm now carries harder knowledge. Every yielded truth draws the city a little farther away from performance and a little closer to understanding. And understanding in the end may be the gentlest destination available to us tonight. Not mastery, not a solved file, not the illusion that one long script could ever exhaust a city like this. Only a quieter, fuller understanding that Boston's lost mysteries are not marginal footnotes to the main story. They are part of the main story. They always were. They simply waited beneath louder chapters for a different kind of attention. Now that attention can soften, the school trace can return to the ground, the gravestone can return to its silence, the island can return to dark water and wind. The West End can return to the guarded tenderness of memory, the burned district can return to maps and ash-colored imagination, the flood can return to that strange border where catastrophe becomes legend but never stops being grief. The empty frames can return to their patient watch, and Boston itself can return to the layered stillness from which we borrowed it for a while tonight. If old cities have lullabies, perhaps this is one of them. Not a song of innocence, but a song of persistence. The persistence of names after buildings, the persistence of outlines after shoreline change, the persistence of communities after demolition, the persistence of records after forgetting, the persistence of evidence after certainty, the persistence of absence after theft, the persistence of the past after every attempt to pave it flat. Boston knows that song well. It has been humming it for centuries, and if you listen very carefully, beneath the obvious stories and the practiced civic voice, you can still hear it now. A harbor city telling two truths at once, a famous city and a buried city, a commemorated city and a recovered city, a city that looks settled, and a city that keeps returning from underneath. That returning is why the mysteries endure, and it is also why the city, for all its losses, never feels empty. Coda, and perhaps the last kindness Boston offers, is this. It does not insist that memory be perfect before it can matter. A city may forget in public and still remember in fragments. A shoreline may vanish from sight and still shape the streets above it. A neighborhood may lose its buildings and still survive in the way former residents speak a block name. A work of art may disappear and still define a room through the space it left behind. A record may sleep for decades and still restore a person to civic visibility the moment someone reads it again. Boston is full of such fragmentary survivals. They do not complete the past. They keep it reachable. and reachable is enough for tonight. Enough to understand that the lost mysteries of Boston were never only about secrets. They were about layers, about what a city places on top of what came before, about which stories rise easily and which must be lifted carefully from underneath, about the quiet persistence of ground, water, memory, and absence. So let the city rest now in all its versions at once. The famous one, the buried one, the vanished one, the waiting one, the one still being uncovered. And somewhere among them, still intact despite everything, the feeling that history in Boston is never very far away. It is simply below the next surface, behind the next wall, across the next stretch of water, or resting in the next file until someone asks the right slow question.